Welcome back to the Career Profiles podcast. I'm your host, Sean, and this is part 2 of the Chris Eubank Career Profile. Now, if you've not listened to part 1 at this point in time, please stop where you are right now and go back and listen to the first part of Chris Eubank's career profile, where we documented his early beginnings, how he entered into the boxing world, some of his professional career leading up to part 2, as well as some stories from his childhood and some side notes in typical Chris Eubank fashion, of course. So please do go and listen to part 1 if you've not already listened to it. But if you're back after listening to part 1, welcome back, because this part really will get into the meat of Chris Eubank's story. We left it in part 1 at the point where he'd now fought his way into contention and was now given an opportunity to fight Nigel Benn. And that's where we're going to pick up the story in part 2. Now, before I do that, I just want to point you guys to make sure that you are following us on social media at BTR Boxing Podcast on Facebook, on Instagram, on TikTok, on YouTube, all the necessary big platforms that are out there. Make sure you are following us, tuning into the content, liking and sharing some of the historical posts and the quotes that I put out there. And the same goes for the podcast side of it. If you're not already subscribed to us, you can do so on Apple, you can do so on Spotify, and all good available podcasting apps out there, as well as tuning into our other shows, the Legendary Nights podcast and the Darker Side of Boxing. So we are going straight in to part 2, and we're going to start with Chris projecting how he was feeling at the time when the fight was announced with Nigel Benn. And from that first public announcement of the Benn fight, which was billed as who's fooling who, it was Chris's perception that almost no one outside of his own immediate circle actually wanted him to win, because Benn was, in many people's eyes, the people's champion. And Chris was almost universally disliked by people. Even if Chris had been more popular at the time, Benn was the public's golden boy. However, Chris had caused much consternation and received quite some belligerent criticism for certain comments that he made about the profession. Namely, this particular comment: boxing is a mug's game. Now, these were to be the 5 most controversial words of Chris Eubank's career. So many people within the sport, fighters, promoters, managers, even enthusiasts, they were incensed. He was accused of hypocrisy, biting the hand that feeds, and condemned as traitorous. He was talking for the fighters, though, yet he was ostracised by so many of them, something that he couldn't understand. For Chris, it was crystal clear common sense. They may not have been the prettiest words that he ever used, but the sentiment behind them was completely indisputable. Now, in his own words, he explains why he actually said such a thing, and it's open to interpretation. These comments were made many, many years ago, but you can certainly listen to what he had to say when I read out the quote and decide whether you think it was the right comment to make and whether it still stands. So he says, let's start with a simple fact. 99% of boxers get disfigured, used, abused, manipulated, and ultimately discarded. Yet 100% of boxers are the single most important element of any fight they compete in. They are the nucleus. The problem is, promoters and managers will have the boxer believe that he is working for them because they pull a lot of the strings in the business. This is totally wrong. The fighter employs the promoters and managers. He is their boss. Without him, there would be no fight business. That is a fact, and I will not accept any argument against that basic statement. A boxer's position of primacy is irrefutable. Issues are immensely complicated behind the scenes in boxing, as we know. Suffice to say, the best man does not always win a fight. Now, as Chris has said in the past about Ronnie Davis, he said he was a superb bodyguard to him, in the sense that what he actually understood was the intricacies of boxing and the politics around it, and he knew how to guide Chris through that minefield. When he was being particularly outspoken, especially in the earlier days before he was champion, Ronnie Davis used to say to Chris, "Be careful, Chris, if you talk too much, they'll have you bumped off." And by bumped off, he meant that arrangements would be made so that he would lose a bout. Fight well, but don't talk too much, Ronnie Davis used to say. Is Chris saying that some fights are fixed? Are we saying that some fights are fixed? Well, it's open to interpretation. You can be the judge of that. There's been many, many, many moments over the course of boxing history where some fights absolutely feel like they've been fixed. But if you ask for too much money or you're behaving like a prima donna, then maybe, just maybe, those fights are fixed. Who knows? Judges can actually be indirectly influenced by things like nice hotel rooms, champagne, women, backhanders. The list goes on. However, fighters would do well to remember these basic things, that the politics is only an illusion, put in place to hold you as a fighter down. Now, if you keep winning, you can still have your own voice. An unbeaten record, of course, empowers. But if you suspect that arrangements have been made against you, you'll simply have to knock the man down before the end of round number 12, or however many rounds the fight is scheduled for. And this is what Chris had to say in his autobiography. He said, "I always used to say the judges had a job to do, and they did it. It never worried me that they might have been influenced. There were several controversial decisions in my career in my favour, which I accepted with gratitude. There were also several suspect decisions too. Collins won, and both Thompson fights. They were all, in my view, questionable decisions. However, just as I had been happy to accept the judge's decision in my favour, I wanted only to do the same when the cards went against me. That was the way my cookie crumbled. To moan about it would have been undignified and wrong. You must never be a bad loser. Take your beating and subsequent defeat with dignity." Well, it wasn't just the wrath of the boxing insiders that Chris had to face for saying boxing was a mugs game. The media, of course, berated him for that statement as well. However, when he tried to explain his reasoning in press conferences, they just weren't interested. He'd never experienced sitting down with them and actually explaining it at length to an audience who may not have agreed, but at least they'd given him a fair hearing. At any one of his press conferences, 75% of what Chris said was philosophy. The Fleet Street mob used to get quite riled by it all, shouting out, "Chris, no, don't go on about philosophy, talk about the fight. Chris, please don't." Well, Chris understood that pure philosophy can be very dry, but even when he tried to tag his theories to an event inside or outside of the ring, the press just wouldn't listen. All they wanted was the tabloid headlines. Much was made of how verbally aggressive Chris was during press conferences, which was largely untrue if you go back and watch it. He's not denying for a second that the word hate was mentioned, but he says it wasn't by him. The sort of language was simply not consistent with his frame of mind and the way he spoke and articulated himself. And one particular moment is, of course, the famous television studio interview on ITV's midweek sports special with Nick Owen, where he was seated next to Benn, Ambrose Mendy, Benn's manager, and Barry Hearn. Now, we've all seen this, absolutely a moment of TV indeed. So, we're going to go more into detail about this now and give Chris's description of what was actually going on there. And he said, "I sat with my back turned to Benn and would not look him in the eye. Indeed, at no point before the fight did I do that in public, which really annoyed him. There was no need for me to look him in the eye because that would have been giving him an advantage to which he was not entitled. There is a fellow called Samuel Johnson, author of the first dictionary in the 16th century, who said, 'Treating your adversary with respect is giving him an advantage to which he is not entitled. Treating your adversary with respect is striking soft in battle.' Now, when questioned by Benn on my refusal to make eye contact, I said, 'I will look you in the eyes when I get in the ring. When I finally do look you in your eyes, it will be when I'm caning you.' That was Chris being a person of truth. He wasn't trying to intimidate him, he was just standing his ground. So the atmosphere in the television studio was somewhat tense, to say the least. Some might say it was bristling. However, if you listen carefully to the answer when asked if he hated Nigel Benn, Chris was very clear and consistent with his stance throughout. He said, 'I don't hate the man. I just want his WBO title.' Chris openly stated that he had a great amount of respect for Benn's punching power. And for his part, Nigel Benn said, 'I personally do hate him.' That was part of the tactic, which was good for the hype. But those sentiments had no place in Chris's world. Of course it was tense, but that was the game that was played. Talking about hate and staring you down. It was Nigel Benn's way of trying to acquire a psychological advantage going into the fight. Chris was not being so personal. He didn't feel he needed to be. He just needed some money and of course the title. He had a method of fighting and living which wasn't the same as Chris's. Chris's method was more sound and psychological, he felt. Different fighters employ different tactics before a fight. Many will try and intimidate a fighter, scare a fighter, or at least unnerve them. Benn's approach was pure venomous intimidation. And yeah, Chris said it was terrifying. It felt very real to him. He was, without doubt, the most terrifying man Chris Eubank says he ever met, and still is. He was aggressive in that televised press conference, but Chris stated he's seen him much more aggressive than that. They were at a Café Royal in London in the build-up to the fight, and he was heading into a room for a meeting. He opened up the door, and there's Barry Hearn, Ambrose Mendes, some trainers, and Nigel Benn. Chris states that he's a polite man, so when he saw they were busy, he said, "Oh, sorry, gentlemen, I can see that you're doing business," and I went to close the door, he said. "Get the fuck out," Benn shouted. "Get out, get fucking out." Chris was astonished. What? Benn continued to throw abusive language at Chris Eubank. "Fucking get out, go on, cunt." Chris's response: "Don't talk to me like that. If we're going to fight, let's do it in the ring." Benn continued there. "Fucking get out." Immediately, Benn jumped up from his chair, marched out from behind the table, and squared up to Chris inches from his face. "What? Do you want it now? You want it now?" Chris was faced with a momentarily important situation. If Benn had won this little skirmish in that room, in doing so, he would have sealed the fight, without a doubt. Chris was dressed in a pristine suit, so he stood his ground, and he imposed himself on the situation and said, "Listen, if you want to get it on, let's do it. But I didn't come here to fight. I came here for a press conference. Let's do it in the ring." By this point, Barry Hearn and Ronnie Davis had got up and stood between them and were saying, "Now come on, boys, come on." Barry's body was actually shaking, throbbing. That's how much tension there was between Eubank and Benn. That was the type of fear that Nigel Benn put into people. He was that vicious. As Chris said, a terrifying man. That was a severe experience. However, all Benn was trying to do was trick Chris. But Chris wasn't going to be intimidated by him and his hostile antics. He was intimidating, but Chris would never let him know that because that would have awarded him the psychological edge and potentially a victory. Now, Chris had his own interpretation of that situation, and this was his outlook. He said, "This man is truly terrifying, but where's your courage? Are you going to let him talk down to you in this manner? Are you going to allow him to get into your head before the fight?" "No way. I could stand up to that," he said. Logically, it was a simple fact, as we had never fought before. He could not know for certain that he would beat me, so therefore I assumed it must be bravado, intimidation tactics. Well, it was in these situations that Chris was able to draw heavily on all his painstaking studies of the philosophy behind the art of war. Being terrified of another boxer is not a weakness if you recognise it. If you can articulate that fear and have reasons for and against that feeling, then you can defeat the person who terrifies you. It was vital for Chris not to lose sight of the fact that this was only a trick by Benn, something that people constantly do to make you feel inferior. One helpful way of stripping him of his aura of fear was at home. Whenever Karen and Chris mentioned Nigel Benn, they called him Benjamin. Chris relished this psychological battle. Just remember where Chris came from on them streets and that hostility that he faced earlier on in his life. He actually suggested that it was Benn who was petrified because Chris was so unpredictable. Of course, Nigel Benn didn't agree. So, having come to accept and rationalise Nigel Benn's intimidation, the next battle was the fight itself. It was perfectly evident to Chris that the bout would be all about resolve. With someone as brutal as Nigel Benn, you can only go in there and win by having complete and absolute conviction in your skills. Chris had both, and he was ready. He went into the fight thinking, "You may not be able to beat me, but you will not knock me out. And it doesn't matter what happens, I know you're not going to knock me out." Chris knew he could outbox him before long. He wasn't even necessarily thinking about the win. It was more about the impossibility of Nigel Benn knocking him out. From the moment he started training, that was Chris's train of thought. This fight was historically awaited. The gate receipts alone at the NEC were over £1 million. for what was the first all-British world middleweight title fight and the richest bout ever at that time in the UK. Unbeknown to the public, Ambrose Mendy had nominated himself as the WBO observer for the taping of Chris's hands. Now, this was something that Chris was obviously going to object to, and if he had known in advance, he would have done. Chris also stated about the fact that the facilities were poor in his dressing room. He had no ice or towels or anything. Then as he walked into the ring, his entrance music was sabotage. Barry Hearn was absolutely furious and said to Chris, "Let's go back to the changing rooms, Chris." Chris said he remained serenely calm and said to Barry when they were back in the locker room, "They've screwed up my dressing room, they've done everything to unnerve me, but the only thing that can beat me is Benn. Nothing else." Chris vaulted into the ring and stood static, calm, cool and collected, and performed his famous pose. Chris knew that 95% of the population thought he's going to get his head kicked in and probably knocked out of the ring and into the fourth row, and that was the kind of rhetoric that was going around. What's more, most of the 12,500 people there wanted to see that too. They were booing Chris from the moment he walked in the ring until he got into the ring, and even some people in the £200 ringside seats were hitting at him. He had a crowd of about 40 or so people up from Brighton out of all them. Now into the fight, and the bell for round one rang, and instantly Benn's pace was berserk. Demented even. Chris couldn't believe that he was so frenzied, and he was clearly trying to blow Chris out of the water within the first few rounds. Chris expected him to come out hard and fast, but even then, maybe, say 60%. His first attack was at 100%, and he never let up on Chris Eubank for the first 3 rounds. So in order to not get extinguished, Chris had to match that pace, and it was a desperate predicament, and nothing less than 100% was essential from Chris as well. Now, Chris knew the force that had wiped out the impressive Iron Barkley in round 1 in Benn's previous fight. He'd rated Benn as a perfect 10 for power and aggression, and he was finding out to his own cost that he was exactly right in the way he marked him. And as a side note, he mentions in his autobiography about the power of Nigel Benn. He said, "People used to talk about Benn as being pound for pound one of the hardest punchers in the game. I can vouch for that. In my opinion, he was equal to what Tyson is reputed to be. Benn's power was simply astonishing. Fight fans ask me which punch of Benn's was the hardest. I say, simple. All of them. Every shot. The jab to the head was like a huge battering ram. His left hook was devastating. When Benn hit you, you stayed hit. Most boxers hit you, and even if it is a good shot, its damage is fleeting. It's just a punch. But when Benn hit you, it was a lucid, lingering punch. It was almost like a living entity whose sole purpose was to wreak havoc inside your skull. That degree of shocking power cannot be trained into someone. It's just within them. The equation is speed and strength and power. But there is a natural factor as well. Benn had the lot. He was so strong, so lightning fast. He was by far the hardest puncher I have ever come across. So, up until round 4, Nigel Benn was on top. Then things got worse. Much worse. In that round, Benn landed a punch, which Chris has spoken about at times over the years. They were in a clinch, and Chris had dropped his head onto Benn's shoulder. Now, when you do that, your jawbone automatically opens. So Chris's jaw relaxed, and his tongue slipped in between his bottom teeth and his top gum shield. At that exact second, Benn nudged him off his shoulder with a jolt, and boom, he hit Chris with a mammoth right uppercut. That seismic impact guillotined his tongue between his own teeth, opening a deep half-inch long laceration that immediately started bleeding heavily down his throat. Chris said he was drinking copious amounts of his own blood from that moment on. He also said, when you swallow blood, it can curdle and choke you, so I didn't tell my corner because Ronnie may have told the referee, who may then have stopped the fight. This was not an option for me. If the referee came too close, I kept my mouth shut. That uppercut was later highlighted in a documentary called Clash of the Titans, where they froze the moment of impact. It felt like my tongue had almost been severed. Chris's resolve, of course, was total, and in the face of such onslaught, his goal was now not about winning the fight, it was about carrying on until the last bell rang. After all, some of the punches from Benn would have probably hospitalised many fighters. Yet, at this lowest point of the fight for Chris, his pre-fight prediction was starting to come true. He'd said to him, "I'll have a surprise for you. When you hit me, I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying there and I'm coming right back at you." From that moment, Chris says he has almost no recollection whatsoever of rounds 4 to 6. He assumed that he was just dealing with that dire situation. And watching the video back of the fight, he confirms it. He says he cannot recall clearly any of those 9 minutes when I was in the ring with a maniacal, mindless fighter. I was kept alive only by gut instinct, integrity and resolve. The sole memory I have from those forgotten rounds was when he dropped me with a body shot that felt as though it had ruptured my being. He had been hitting my abdomen with body shots from the opening bell, but this one, in particular, had a near calamitous effect on me. He hit me low, and had gone down to recover as he had disturbed my genital area. When the referee said box on, as I came in, Benn slipped to one side and boom, it was a body shot that nearly broke me in two. I can see on the video that I went into evasive mode, but continued to use short, sharp jabs and chopping rights that he was running onto, while his cornermen were shouting, "Get to him to the body, he can't take it." That is the single memory from those 3 rounds that has forced itself through my amnesia by the sheer power of the punch. Chris then states his memory returns fully by the round 7, and he started to notice that Nigel Benn had blown himself out. Of course, you can't keep up a pace like that. Perhaps understandably, he probably thought that no one could withstand such a barrage, but he had not reckoned with Chris's resolve. He was still there. He was still fighting. He was still standing upright. Suddenly, he was no longer coming on ferociously without regard. Benn had regard, and this changed everything. All the time, he'd had no regard for Chris's punching ability and ringcraft. There was nothing Chris could do but weather the storm, face the tornado, but in doing so, he eventually forced Nigel Benn to treat him with regard. Now that Chris was in his zone, he had closed one of Nigel Benn's eyes, and that was a substantial handicap because this was no longer a contest of brutality. This had evolved into a cat-and-mouse game of strategy. That was where Chris was king. That was his specialty. He had studied this part of the art form intensely. In this type of fight, he says, "I have a PhD. Now the fight belonged to me." That said, he didn't suddenly think he'd win, not least because you could not control how the judges were going to score it. It was still a matter of staying in there for Chris. The emphasis, though, had changed at this point, and he was always going to counterpunch better. He would strike, get out of range and strike again as he moved in, back out, and so on. He started to pick Benn off. His eye was badly swollen now, and the tide had turned in Chris's favour. Unlike earlier fights like the Simon Collins fight, when he mentioned earning ring time and owning your craft with an opponent as dangerous as Benn, you have to finish the fight at the first opportunity. Benn had, after all, beaten men almost at the moment that he himself was teetering into unconsciousness. And you can't play with people like that. You have to finish the fight. The end came in the 9th when Benn hit Chris with a shot that kind of landed on his bum. Chris went down, off balance, then got back up and brushed his gloves off. Then Chris hit him with a string of jabs, then a right hand, and Benn's legs went. Now it was Chris's time to bombard. Chris was on overdrive, autopilot, raining the blows in. With fighters as awesome as Nigel Benn, you can't deliberate. You've got to take him out when you can. And I'm going to let Chris describe from his autobiography what the actual moment the fight was stopped was like for him. He says, "The actual moment in time when the ref intervened and stopped Benn, thus making me world champion, is very hard to describe. I turned to the centre of the ring, gloves clasped together, and screamed skywards, head turned towards the glaring lights above the ring. My whole body was tensed, and in feral roar I unleashed 8 years of training, of learning the art, of isolation, of punishment and pain." The moment Chris describes was actually captured by a photographer, and that photo actually won the Photographer Sports Photograph of the Year. For Chris, he had completed the first stage of his journey. He had honoured all those years of work and application. He'd done it. The feeling for Chris was overwhelming. If you watch the fight back now, the words of Rudyard Kipling spring to mind, almost as if he was commentating on the fight, telling Chris to force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn, long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. The poem goes on to say that if you can do all these things, then yours is the earth and everything that is in it. Winning the fight and becoming world champion for Chris Eubank, it wasn't just all about that. We mentioned it in part 1, there were actually practical benefits of him winning the Benn fight, such as being able to keep the house in old showroom robe, but in the highly charged, ultra-emotional aftermath of a battle like that, the material benefits are not on the mind of a fighter. When a fighter has been in a really tough fight, he bares his soul, he reveals what's really on his mind. All Chris could do was talk honestly, and his truth was the desire to marry Karen. As Chris has said, his view was that unless he made something of himself, namely champion, he didn't deserve her hand in marriage. And when he was interviewed by Gary Newbon, the realisation filled his mind. It wasn't premeditated, but he turned into the camera and said, "Karen, can we get married now? Can we get married? Marry me, Karen." That question may have been transmitted into millions of homes, but it was purely a private affair between Chris and Karen. Just remember though, Chris, he was still a loner. He didn't really keep any other company, and the only person he really knew was Karen. She had since told him that she was actually shouting, "Yes, yes," at the screen. Gary Newbon then asked Chris another question as he was in excruciating pain. He said, "I have to go to the hospital now." And as he said those words, the years of craving acceptance from his brothers and never receiving it welled up in Chris's soul. And as he turned from the camera, he said, Peter Eubank, I did it. I told you I'd do it, man." For all Chris's detractors before the Nigel Benn fight, the aftermath saw the bout recognised by many as arguably the greatest ever to take place in the British ring. Certainly the best all-British contest. Some observers said it was the start of the modern era of British boxing. This was all tribute to both of the fighters, of course, but it was rewarding for Chris that he was finally recognised for the skills and application that he possessed. In his opinion, he said he'd shown himself as the ultimate boxer for what he achieved that night. The better opponents always make a fighter win with more style or integrity, and vice versa with the poorer fighters. Even Benn acknowledged that Chris was the better fighter on the night, although he said weight loss problems had not helped him. Ambrose Mendy later told John Regan that he felt it was Benn's best ever fight. The fight itself was a landmark for the career of Chris Eubank. Benn was a man who the country felt was going to beat him, yet he had not finished the fight. Chris said he didn't go to the after-fight party, he just wanted to get home to see Karen and talk about the marriage proposal. The next day he spoke to the media in Brighton and explained how Benn had broken his body, but could never have beaten his mind. At one point, Ronnie Davis had to help him out of bed and put him in the bath. For a week after that fight, Chris said he was urinating and excreting blood. At one point, there was some concern for his welfare, but he slowly started to recover. Normally, Chris would be back in the gym training after a couple of days after a fight, but this time his body had to be rested for 2 weeks. He says the tongue injury was agony. He couldn't eat easily and he couldn't drink anything hot. That took 7 weeks to fully heal, he said. Ronnie was typically scathing of Chris, offering him bags of salt and vinegar crisp after the press conference. Of course, being the world champion for Chris was a magnificent feeling. In the weeks after the victory, people would come up to Chris in the street and congratulate him, which was rewarding given that nobody really wanted him to win the fight. Many of them said, "We always thought that you were better than Benn." But that wasn't the point. You win and raise your standard of living and profile after winning a fight. You lose, and you don't, and you have to go back to the drawing board. That's the case in boxing. Once he returned back to the gym following the Nigel Benn fight, he said that he started opening his training sessions up to the public to actually raise money for charity, but also to get across to anyone who was willing to listen that he wasn't arrogant. The charge was usually a nominal fee, and once the doors had flung open, floods of people came in, and he just poured out all that philosophy stuff and advice to people. Ronnie Davis used to complain, saying, "You're talking more than you train, kid." However, Chris explained to him that he had refined and streamlined the art so well that to speak to those people that were coming in was like trading. As Chris places so much emphasis on the philosophy behind boxing, he says a man's integrity and frame of mind by passing my views about life over to people, well, I felt like I was owning my own approach. I was training philosophically. He also said, "Don't get me wrong, you are not going to get in the prime physical condition needed for a world title fight by talking. You have to train relentlessly. Plus, until you have studied the philosophy yourself, learnt the skills flawlessly, and perfected the entire package through years of repetition and practice, then you should not be spending energy advising others. However, certain parts of my fighting mechanisms were so well oiled that by offering such advice, I inspired myself, and in doing so, I became more vibrant and positive. In the face of brutality of a bout, that could only be a good thing. Ronnie Davis never understood that, and neither did anyone else, he said. So what advice did Chris offer? Well, he says, all sorts, everything. He would present analogies with the practical art of boxing. So, for example, he would expose the beauty of the right uppercut to the body. As in life, go straight to your target. And that doesn't mean that there won't be obstacles in your way. There probably will be. You'll still go straight for the target and just disregard the obstacles and don't let them distract you. Don't lose your focus. There were so many snippets of advice about actual boxing technique or thinking that could literally be applied to almost any general part of life. Chris said boxing is a great metaphor. Following Chris's on-screen proposal to Karen, she gladly accepted, and they were married only 36 days later on the 23rd of December following the fight in Brighton. At the time, Karen was 4 months pregnant with Sebastian, and later she told Chris she was even having morning sickness in her wedding dress. They were married at St. Peter's Church and drove across to the reception, which took up the entire ground floor atrium of the Ramada Hotel on the seafront. He said, we had boxing gloves on the invite and a layer of cake for each of the 9 Benn rounds. Barry Hearn was the best man and made a great speech. It was a momentous day. I was so lucky to have married this girl. Remember, when I first glimpsed her in that kitchen, I'd shook my head thinking she was out of this world. They honeymooned in Barbados, but even there, the intrusion of the media was a hard escape. A photographer had been following them around all week, which they said was fine to begin with, and he said it was okay, but then he just wouldn't stop. At one point, they were relaxing on the beach, and he actually stuck the lens pretty much in their faces. Chris said, that's enough. And he pushed the photographer away. He was then arrested for assault. He was taken to a wooden hut, which was the courtroom, and given a small fine, although they banned the photographer from ever entering the country again. So, was this the life of a world champion? Chris's first title defence after beating Nigel Benn was against Dan Sherry. Now, although he was ranked at number 10, Chris had rated him a 7 as a fighter. He was unbeaten in 17 bouts, which meant he was relatively inexperienced for a title shot, but his record was strong, so Chris knew he would have inner strength. He was managed by Sugar Ray Leonard and had been sparring with lifers at a US prison in the build-up to the fight. Also being trained by Pepe Correa meant he would have certain qualities that he needed to be wary of. Dan Cherry was very respectful to Chris beforehand, but Chris knew again, this was only a trick. Boxing is rife with such things. He was all smiles like the clean-cut North American hero calling Chris Mr. Eubank. That nicety was even more of an insult. Well, why do you think that? Well, because Chris knew he was a fighter who taunted opponents in the ring verbally and physically, and would use roughhouse or underhand tactics to get a result. The big smile for Chris was a transparency, a really thin facade. Sherry said that he thought Chris thought too much, suggesting that perhaps Chris didn't know his craft as well as he thought he did. Before the fight, Chris's view was, well, Sherry, can you walk like you talk it? The Brighton Centre was full for the fight, and almost as soon as the bell rang for the first round, Chris's predictions were proved completely correct. He began quickly taunting Chris verbally. That was stopped briefly when Chris dropped him with a hard jab in the opening round. Sherry got himself up and jabbed his way to safety. He was a good fighter at hitting and running. That was the bad news for Chris because he was low on energy. In those days, the weigh-in was actually on the day of the fight, and Chris had come in a little bit over the weight limit, so he needed to go for a run on the beach to sweat off the excess before weighing in. Dan Cherry was a competent boxer with a good jab, but this was never going to be a classy bout. In fact, Chris told the media after that he was punching like a lightweight. At one point, Ronnie Davies felt like Chris was treating Cherry with too little regard. However, Cherry really started some silly antics about halfway through the bout. His verbally snide remarks actually increased, and then he started to mimic Chris's moves. In the 7th round, he struck one of Chris's own poses and started to showboat. When he started this parading, Chris admitted he began to get frustrated. He wasn't bringing Chris any kind of test. So Chris said to him, come on, come and fight. In the 9th round, Chris caught Sherry with a vicious uppercut which badly sliced his mouth. The blood was flowing fairly freely from the wound. Interestingly, at this point, the media, who were so often against Chris, were actually at the ring apron shouting, "Chris, stay on him. Go on, Chris." Although they actually made no secret of their feelings towards Chris, they wanted the title to stay in the UK. They misunderstood Chris as a human, but recognised the importance of Chris keeping the title. Unfortunately, what happened next was something that Chris deeply regrets as soon as he did it. The next round, Sherry was verbally abusing Chris, using racist terms and deriding him abhorrently. As soon as they got into the clinch on the ropes, Chris somehow come to have his back against Dan Sherry's stomach. And it was at this second Sherry kissed Chris's neck 2 or 3 times. Chris said, "I could feel his breath on me." Combined with the racial abuse, well, it made me lose control. I flicked my head back instinctively to move the offending kisses away. Sherry took the opportunity to overreact, making as though I'd headbutted him with venom, when in fact I'd hardly made contact. The problem was, what had started off as play acting nearly cost Sherry his life. In flailing around the ring, he actually swallowed enough of his own blood to cause himself to collapse. The ringside doctor, Tony Buckland, rushed in and had to administer hasty preventative treatment. Initially, one of Sherry's eyes was not reacting to a light, a sure sign of concussion in a fighter. He'd also been choking, and there was chaos in the arena while all this was going on. Fortunately, to Chris's relief, Sherry was back on his feet in no time and made a full recovery. However, Chris's impulsive head jerk was to cost him dearly, in more ways than one. He was deducted 2 points for what they called a headbutt, but still won the fight on a technical knockout, as Sherry was not in a position to continue. The referee, Frank Sator Jr., said Sherry had not been fighting like a gentleman, so Chris's own indiscretion was actually treated with a little more leniency, although some observing members of the British Boxing Board of Control said they might have disqualified Chris. This fight was not under their jurisdiction, though, so the decision was given to Chris. The media reaction to this decision, and the fight in general, was quite poor for Chris. Many said that he felt like he'd lost on points, something that he didn't agree with, of course. They jumped on the unsavoury conclusion to his first defence as a chance to angrily berate his character. One reporter said, "My carefully constructed image had been badly tarnished." Still, others belittled Chris's WBO belt as a cardboard crown. One thing Chris said after that, "Well, let me tell you something, it hadn't felt like that when I was in the ring with Nigel Benn." The media coverage missed the point. Chris was wholly apologetic for those actions. He was fined £10,000 by the British Boxing Board of Control, whose 22-man hearing, led by former police detective Leonard Nipper Reid, had found Chris guilty of bringing the business into disrepute. That figure rivalled the biggest fine to date in Britain, which was levied on Errol Christie and Mark Haley for a press conference punch-up a few years earlier. Their penalty was later reduced on appeal, but Chris personally had no intention of protesting. The panel also issued Chris with a reprimand about his future conduct. And the thing to note is that, yes, Chris had acted impulsively and in doing so broken the rules and regulations of the business, but to make matters worse, it had been watched by millions of television viewers in over 30 countries. For that error of judgment, Chris had to be fined. He agreed with that premise and accepted his fine without complaint. Indeed, he said it was unprofessional and will happen again, but he could not have been more accepting of the fine. Of course, the press dwelled on the so-called headbutt and the subsequent fine, seeming to be less interested in the $5,000 that he had actually given to Comic Relief that same week. Now, around this time, Henry Cooper criticised Chris heavily in the press, saying that he was too serious and had an attitude. Chris has always looked up on Henry Cooper as a good role model who teaches by example and is a very well-behaved man outside of the ring. When Henry Cooper criticised Chris, it was unfair and it was harsh. But, of course, it's each to his own. Everyone has their views. Chris had his own. Henry Cooper had his own. But Chris always says, I'd also give him credit as a gentleman. At this point in time, everybody in the boxing world wanted to get rid of Chris Eubank. And his next opponent, Gary Stretch, was another individual that didn't like him and wanted to get rid of him. Now, Gary Stretch at the time was a very good-looking man. There was a lot made of his boxing male model in the press, But Chris wasn't really interested in all that. One of his first encounters with Gary Stretch was actually at the Benn press conference when he'd interrupted proceedings, pointed to Chris and said to Benn, "Leave a piece of him for me." It was quite personal then in the lead up to the fight, saying that he didn't regard Chris as a world champion, and his corner were quite similar, derogatory towards them. And Chris just knew it was all business leading up to it. However, John Regan believed Gary Stretch was totally psyched out by Chris before the fight. He may have looked pampered, but Stretch actually fought with great heart. Chris himself had somewhat reluctantly gone along with Barry Hearn's big fanfare and was actually accompanied to the ring for the fight with Union Jack waving girls in a gesture that Barry said was for the fellows out in the Gulf War. Chris wasn't entirely comfortable with all of that razzmatazz, but he always had an eye on what would sell, and this was the first of several big London bouts for Chris. Stretch came down to the ring at the Olympia to the theme music from Rocky, which is normally really corny, but he actually pulled it off. It was very stirring. Nevertheless, it didn't bother Chris. What nearly did bother Chris was a big booming left hand that he landed in the first seconds of the first round. Chris knew then he had to be on his guard. Stretch did win some of the early rounds and even stood defiantly battling toe-to-toe with Chris until Chris eventually stopped him in the sixth round. And this would then lead Chris nicely into his next fight, which was another British boxing hero of the time, a certain Michael Watson. Now, we talked about Chris in part 1 of how he used to mark his opponents out of 10. Well, in this instance, Michael Watson was an 8, and the lead up to the bout was perhaps not unusually less than cordial. Watson said he had brought the business of boxing into the gutter, and that Chris was working against the integrity of legends like Muhammad Ali and Sugar Ray Leonard, who had lifted the perception of the sport. This then started to annoy Chris very much, but he realised this was mainly due to the tabloid press goading them to fight like fighting cocks. Watson was speaking in a colonial way to Chris, and he felt slighted, but it hadn't brought the sport into the gutter, and this was about boxers getting misused and damaged, and Chris felt he was talking in Watson's favour. He also said that Chris was a phony, but this was such a base comment that it actually didn't really bother Chris whatsoever. It wasn't offensive, it was just wrong about him. All Chris wanted to do after that was just disprove his opponent. He'd already shown that he wasn't a phony in the Benn fight and many others, but it was still for Watson, who was the Commonwealth champion, to recognise this. After all, certain facts about both of them were indisputable, not least that they were the only two fighters to have beaten Nigel Benn. Michael Watson was considered by many to be a technically very talented fighter, and his sixth-round defeat of Nigel Benn in 1989 was regarded as a definitive example of his calibre. Watson said that Chris had a good chin, but was too brave for his own good. Of course, the anti-Eubank media circus was always in full flow for the fight against the man who was the newest people's champion in Michael Watson. One headline called Chris Britain's most disliked world champion ever. The boxing fraternity was still not giving him the credit he deserved. They knew he was good, but the people who have the power, namely the media, just wouldn't give him any plaudits. In many ways, Chris said he wasn't in prime condition for what was to be a £1 million showdown. He had a bruised sternum from a left hook he took off his sparring partner and former opponent Simon Collins. He also had a cricked neck, which restricted how much quality sleep he could get in the week before the fight. The most difficult of all, however, was that when Ronnie weighed him on the Tuesday before the fight, he was well a stone above his weight limit. He had until Saturday to lose all that excess. In the event, he lost 19 pounds in 4 days. That was through total abstinence of food and water, and full, exhausting training at the same time. Chris said, "There is nothing harder than to train when you have nothing in your stomach. You retch, you feel faint, you're stretching yourself to the limit. When you dry out to that extreme, it is difficult to even blink. Your eyes are so dehydrated." Chris said, "I had to periodically plunge my head into a sink of water to soothe the dryness. 4 days without food or water makes you retch at your own breath. I used to even have the complimentary fruit bowls removed from my hotel rooms just because the smell of an apple or orange was torture." The evening before the fight, John Regan was with Chris in his room at the coach house, and he wanted to get a bag off the floor. He couldn't face picking it up, so he asked John to help him. Then Chris stood up and blacked out. He found out afterwards that this really scared John Regan, that he went home and told his wife Sylvia, Chris can't even pick up an empty carrier bag. Our lad's in trouble. He couldn't sleep that night. So for Chris, it was about training first, health second. Dealing with the pain now and then worrying about his health another time. He needed the win. He claims it wasn't ideal, it wasn't a great method of preparing for a weigh-in that he worked for his previous 27 fights for, but he couldn't do it for this. Even with intensive physiotherapy, the weight problems stopped Chris sparring 4 days before the fight, which is not Chris's usual deadline. There was always so much speculation about his weight. This time, there were also rumours that Watson had not reached the 11 stone 6 pound weight limit too easily either. Chris went into this fight in front of 11,000 people at Earl's Court, knowing that once again, pretty much all of them were against him. He strutted up and did his usual vault, brimming with energy. John was in the front row shaking his head, remembering how exhausted Chris had been the night before when he asked him to pick up that empty bag. Chris said he wasn't worried. His exhaustion only ever set in after a fight, never before. When Watson entered the ring, he was warned immediately for shadow boxing in Chris's corner. Again, none of it fazed Chris. Some observers had incorrectly stated that Watson would be too skilled for Chris, even making the Force, as he was called, the pre-fight favourite. So the first bell rings, and Chris stays motionless for 5 seconds. He doesn't know why, but he just did, and Watson came at Chris and moved forward and stopped, startled, unsure of what Chris was actually doing. Chris said that the first 6 rounds were actually a breeze, all easy and beautiful. He said he won them unquestionably. Watson took some hard punishment in the 5th round, at the end of which he poked his tongue out at Chris. This, of course, was just ring antics, and it didn't affect him at all. He never watched what his opponents were doing. He had to get them to think about what he was doing. Once he had his opponents thinking about what he was doing, he had them beat, Chris said. After the first 6 rounds, in Chris's eyes, he'd done enough. He fought on the retreat, hitting and moving, something which large sections of the crowd, of course, didn't like. However, Chris said he's in there to win the fight, to score more points than his opponent, and Watson was not a man to be trifled with. At the end of the 12th round, Watson actually jumped in the air in anticipation of triumph. However, if he had been given the decision, it would have been wrong. 2 judges scored in favour of Chris and 1 gave it a draw, so the decision was Chris Eubank's. Many people felt he had won the fight, as in Watson. Chris didn't agree with that, and watching that fight back even now, you can't really give him the title. He didn't do enough to take that belt from Chris. Chris said he was running on empty by the 10th round, but he still didn't do enough. It was the right result, but of course there was uproar. Watson's legion of vocal Arsenal fans were booing. In parts it seemed there was a near riot, a scandal, that he'd been robbed. They all wanted a rematch. Chris's immediate concern, however, was getting back to his dressing room in one piece. The tabloids reported that Chris had been attacked by an angry hate mob and only narrowly escaped severe injury. That actually wasn't exaggerated, and it is true. For quite a few moments, Chris said, they had coins thrown at him, he was spat, he was verbally abused, he was just, at a moment, fearing for his own life. Nonetheless, he had again defended his crown. It was still a very bad time, though, because he was still regarded as the villain of villains. The public still didn't like him, the tabloids still didn't like him, and nobody wanted the anti-hero to win, but Chris did. Ideally, in Chris's mind, after this fight, he would have liked some rest, because this was his 4th title bout in only 8 months. It was inevitable, given the first fight, that there was going to be a rematch between Michael Watson and Chris Eubank. And that was arranged, and only happened 3 months after the first one. In the press conferences and publicity for the second fight, Watson took several angry verbal swipes at Chris. He said he was going to beat Chris and send him to the public. I mean, where does something like that come from unless you have that level of malice within you? Why say something like that? Well, I think what Chris feels about this is that in private, Michael Watson knew that Chris wasn't a phony fighter and that he was just trying to get under Chris's skin. He actually turned it around, Chris, and said at one point that unless he stopped insulting him, he'd only fight unless he was ordered to. He also said, I have a fabulous wife, 2 gorgeous kids, a big house with no mortgage and the world title. Do you still think I'm a pretender? Some of the comments in the build-up to the second fight were from Michael Watson's perspective. Well, Chris felt they were just uncalled for. The pre-fight atmosphere was one of strong mutual dislike, and Chris actually stormed out of one of the press conferences after first calling him a whinging child. He said Watson moaned about everything, even making fun of Chris's habit for wearing sunglasses in a darkened room. The thing is, they both made comments about each other that the British Boxing Board of Control frowned upon, although the media highlighted Chris's statement that was the kill or be killed situation. In Chris's mind, he obviously had no intention of executing that type of a comment, but it's, in boxing terms, it's what's used to describe the fierce competitive nature of the business. He also said that Watson was so low he could wear a top hat and still crawl under a snake, which was just meant as a colourful jibe. Ironically, after 6 vitriolic weeks of bitter recriminations between them, the last press conference before the fight was remarkably subdued, even polite. The fight itself was at the home of Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, White Hart Lane. The atmosphere was at fever pitch, it was hypes, it was mad. Watson came into the arena to the LL Cool J track, I'm Gonna Knock You Out, which Chris said didn't really faze him, it just made him feel disrespected even more than he already felt disrespected. As Chris was walking to the ring, a man in the crowd actually stopped Chris's guards, looked Chris in the eye and snarled a stream of obscenities at Chris before spitting in his face. Chris said, I just recall thinking, if this was in the street and I was a lesser man, I'd rip you apart. The hatred vented towards Chris was quite shocking. He said, I don't know if that could be attributed to Watson's strong Arsenal following, but the football hooligan element was very prevalent and threatening that night. Chris said, I found out later that there were scores of plain-clothed police officers mingling with the crowd, looking for the known troublemakers. This second Watson fight was at the new weight of super middleweight, a title which had been vacated by Thomas Hearns. The fight should have been made at 12 stone, but it was made at 11 stone 10, Watson's weight. Chris said he was actually lighter weighing in at 11 stone 8. He don't know why this happened, but the decision was made behind closed doors. He didn't think to raise the issue with Barry Hearn at the time because he trusted him. It was also a matter of pride. He wanted to prove to everyone that he could fight and beat Michael Watson at any weight. Most bookies had them at even odds beforehand, but boxing insiders felt like the weight would actually work to Chris's advantage, not least by Chris not having to sap all his energy for the weigh-in. Some people felt there should have been a longer gap before the rematch, and some felt Watson, after tough fights with Mike McCallum and the first fight with Chris, might have actually benefited from more rest. However, from the first second of the opening round, Watson's pace was maniacal. To this day, the boxing fraternity says he keeps up a pace of a lightweight, not a super middleweight. Some even suggested that this is what cost Watson so dearly. He just didn't stop. Chris hit him with everything, very hard shots, yet with every punch he landed, Watson just kept on coming forward, hitting Chris hard, pressing forward relentlessly. Chris said that he's never been beaten up as much as in that fight. He says he got absolutely battered in the Michael Watson rematch. Now, by round 4, Chris says he was in survival mode, even more so after he opened up a gash over Chris's left eye. By round 6, he says he was severely vulnerable. He was taking such a beating. At the end of that round, he slumped on his stool and he said to Ronnie Davis, he's so strong. He was easily a 10 plus on my scale, he said. From then, Chris felt like he knew he was unbeatable. The object was now just to stay on his feet like he did in the first Benn fight. Chris said, subconsciously, I knew I could not win that fight from round 6. People say to me, so why did you stay in the fight? There is a very simple but extremely important answer. To take my beating. I was intent on taking my punishment, and from the 6th round to the 11th round, I did. Why? Because that is the integrity of a fighter. Deciding that I couldn't win the fight was a grim mistake to make, however. I was getting pummeled, but to admit I couldn't win was a damaging error. I must advise every young boxer out there never ever to make the same blunder. The reason for this is that as soon as you decide such a thing, the adrenaline in your body stops pumping, and then suddenly the pain of the punches is no longer masked. That is why his shots were so painful. They hurt severely, excruciatingly. Even if you can't win, never give up, or the pain will no longer be held at bay. Now, during the 9th round, Chris was taking a lot of punishment, multiple hard combinations. It was so painful, he said, especially those big right hands over the top. However, Chris would not quit despite the continued barrage. He even managed to make Michael Watson bleed from the nose. And he says he remembers thinking of Watson as a flame. He somehow pictured a candle in his mind's eye. He remembers thinking, if you so much as flicker, I will do my best to finish you. Crucially, at this point, Watson's now humiliating Eubank. And when you beat a man, just beat him, pick him off, move around, he'll still come after you. But he won't have enough venom to make any difference. If you humiliate him, then you're injecting venom into this person's subconsciousness. Watson battered Chris into a sense of vindictiveness. He was beating him up with malice. It might not have looked like that on TV at the time. It might even have looked like Chris was holding his own. But Chris said he was being beaten dreadfully. By round 11, Chris said he was physically annihilated. But in the final minute of the round, he threw everything into this last assault, which he spent the very last of his energy that he had. He was flailing punches at Watson, but by this point, the exhaustion was so all-encompassing that there was absolutely nothing in the punches. Watson backed off onto the ropes, which slackened, and then Watson moved to the side, prompting Chris to fall onto the ropes himself face first. Chris said he didn't even have the strength to push himself back up off the ropes. Jim Watt was commentating at the time, and he made this reference saying, you can't fault Eubank's desire, but he seems to have used up a lot of effort. Still, Michael Watson's pace never swayed, he just kept on coming. Jim Watt said, he must be really demoralised, Eubank's given his best work, at which point Reg Gutteridge came in and said, here it is, can he have him over? And the end seemed to be near. At that exact moment, Chris's thought was this. He said, I still wanted to do everything in my power to stay on my feet, to take the beating. If there was no power in my body, then I had to draw off every last ounce of what was left in my mind to stay standing. It was torturous. In such a state, I was barely able to punch. Yet Watson, 11 rounds in, just kept coming with blistering clusters of 4 and 5 punch combinations. Reg Gutteridge said, Eubank has so much courage. And as he did so, Watson just stepped back from his onslaught, paused, then came in again with one last club. At that point, Chris said his senses had been impaired. Ordinarily, that club would have probably floored Chris, but before that, 2 right hooks had scored and concussed him, knocking his nervous system out. He said his body's muscle control had essentially gone when that club punch hit him on the back of the neck. So despite the gargantuan efforts of every exhausted sinew in his frame, he slumped down on his right knee. Chris explains what it was like in this moment, and he says, people talk about the qualities needed to make a great fighter. There are many, but one of the essentials is constitution. That microsecond before my knee hit the canvas, I was a spent force, battered, agonised and wrecked. Yet, the exact instant in time that my knee touched the canvas, I had recovered completely. It was almost as though a colossal pulse of negative energy collected from this hideous beating I had taken had immediately discharged itself. It felt like the canvas had earthed all the hurt. I did not look to my corner. I knew my body had come back to me instantly. I stood up straight, breathed in, and looked around the stadium. I sensed the crowd of 25,000 hovering for my demise. Their hysteria was tangible. Get rid of this man! I could only really see the first few rows, but it felt like the whole stadium was salivating for my blood. Bear in mind, the only people in the arena who weren't baying for my dereliction was my immediate circle, perhaps about 50 people. I moved forward and threw just one shot, which had in it frustration, exhaustion, resolve and instinct. Watson's guard throughout the fight had been ready for one of my big right hands over the top, but in shielding against that, he left a 3-inch gap between his fist and forearms that this near-perfect uppercut penetrated. His legs went backwards, and the force lifted him off the ground. He got up, and the bell rang for the end of the 11th. I think the referee was about to stop the fight when the bell went. He was clearly dazed, and his cornerman had to pull him back to his stool. There was pandemonium in the auditorium, mixed with silence and disbelief. Watson had won 8 out of 11 rounds. All he had to do now to win the fight was stay on his feet. With the 12th round about to begin, Chris knew He needed a knockout to win. But Watson seemed too strong. Would he recover? Chris got up for the last 3 minutes, not knowing if Watson would be able to carry on. Both of them stood up and the referee stood between them. But Watson wasn't coming to touch gloves, so Chris walked forward. As he moved towards Watson, the referee, Roy Francis, called out to Watson, who muttered something, and Chris read his lips. Just 1 minute. No, you get no minutes. This is my time now, Chris said. Chris fired off a flash of punches, very fast, and at one point, he caught Watson flush. His rear leg wasn't moving. Chris wasn't sure, but he sensed he was in trouble. At this stage, even though you're in the final round, if you hit someone between 12 and 17 times unanswered, and the fighter's just covering up, the ref has a duty to stop the fight. Chris said, we were only 29 seconds into the final round when Watson was stopped from continuing. Reg Gutteridge said in a tone of disbelief, Eubank has brought it out of nowhere. In the ring after the fight, Gary Newbon interviewed Chris and he said, I want him tested. At that point there was some kind of commotion in the ring, but Newbon picked up on Chris's words and what was said. What was that you were saying about drugs? I said no, but that was perceived by Watson's campers defamatory. Chris said he's not the type of person to accuse someone of taking drugs. If Watson had just been eating bananas, he would have wanted to know what was in his blood. He simply wasn't the same man as in the first fight. Chris never thought he was on drugs, not for 1 second. He just wanted to know, where did his strength and the drive come from? At this point, Watson had to be stretchered out of the ring, but they couldn't get him out quick enough because it was pandemonium in the arena. Chris could see all his friends trying to get to him. Other people were fighting and kicking ringside. Security men were trying to keep people out of the ring. It was just utter chaos. At one point, Chris thought the people trying to come into the ring were after him, but he later realised it was just acquaintances who wanted to congratulate him. That being said, Chris said he felt in danger, and on the tapes of the fight you can actually see that's what he's thinking. Let's get the hell out of here. Worse still, he was near to tears and dangerously exhausted, so much so that Ronnie had to help him get dressed. He borrowed a jacket of his cousin's to disguise himself before heading back to the dressing room. Ronnie later said that in the ring, when he saw Chris's severe fatigue, he was actually frightened for him. Now, in the light of the damage that Michael Watson had received prior to that last round, many felt that he should have never gone out for it. But if the ref had actually stopped the bout at the end of the 11th, which he probably should have done, many people felt that Chris probably would have been lynched, and those in the crowd who were against Chris would have said it was a fix, especially in light of what was said after the first encounter between them. It actually felt like the British public didn't like Chris and the boxing fraternity liked him less. More appropriately, if there had been a clear path, they would have got Watson out of the arena much more quicker than what they did. Then, when he was clear of the crowd, they took him to the wrong hospital. By the time they got him there, where he needed to be, there was actually a blood clot on his brain, and essentially the damage to Michael Watson was done. So the precise moment that the crowd thought Chris Eubank was finished, Chris said he was actually just beginning. He said, "This is what I call the killing time." Purely a term in boxing, nothing sinister meant by those choice of words, these are just Chris's words. He said, "When my right knee hit the floor, the killing time had been created. The finish of the fight was near. Whoever then had the conviction to go forward without hesitation would win. Watson created that moment, and I took advantage of it. When the killing time arrives, either fighter can seize the moment. Watson could certainly have taken it because Chris said he had absolutely nothing left in him but for that one punch. He created the moment for that punch. He had awakened what Chris said was the warrior within him, and that so rarely happens only in the most extreme of circumstances for a boxer. In the fight business, that degree of instinct can only be awakened in the most severe of situations, when a boxer is already physically spent, when you've got no more armoury other than your grit and resolve. The warrior being awakened is never a conscious process, Chris said. It all comes down to integrity. If you're not true within, the warrior will never be there for you. He said, I had been comprehensively beaten in every round since the third, outmanoeuvred, outpunched, outthought and outfought. To stay in there and take his beating took immense integrity, Chris said. When he was knocked to the floor with 30 seconds left of the penultimate round, when Chris knew all the judges' cards were against him when he felt his opponent was still strong and still coming forward. Why did he still get up? Well, it was a fight he couldn't win in. It was an impossible situation. Chris said, I was only getting up to take yet more punishment. I wasn't thinking about winning. I was in there only to finish on my feet. Why? Because that is truth. That is integrity. That's what separates the men from the boys, the greats from the ordinary. After the fight, journalist Harry Mullen wrote an article which said, only the rarest kind of man can dig so deep into his soul. Eubank made the transition from strutting showman to a champion of genuine worth. Chris would say, that is because I stayed the course. It was a unique fight, and you will not hear of another fight that boxing enthusiasts say ended like that. Benn 1, as desperate as it was, did not include the warrior. There was no killing time. That fight was about unequivocal resolve. Watson 2 witnessed the killing time, and that philosophy only ever happened to me once. The unparalleled circumstances opened up a conduit or channel that very, very few people know about and can tap into. Although Watson 2 was my hardest fight, both mentally and physically, it was also by far the most special fight of my career. In the dressing room after the Watson fight, I sat in the dark for a long time with John Regan. I was informed that Watson had been hurt, but it did not become apparent just how badly until the following morning. That, coupled with my total exhaustion, made me distressingly low. In the dressing room, I refused to go to the hospital, but could not actually stand up, so Barry Hearn insisted on putting me in a wheelchair. I was then indeed hospitalised myself, suffering from exhaustion and internal injuries. My body began to recover from the terrible beating, but unfortunately, Watson's injuries were far more severe. After Chris's treatment, he went to see Michael Watson in hospital. He avoided using the front entrance where all the cameras were waiting for the numerous celebrities with their excessive or extravagant bouquets of flowers. Instead, Chris went about 1:30 in the morning through the back entrance. Obviously, the media coverage had been understandably intense at the time. Of paramount concern was Watson's health, which obviously overshadowed the fact that this had been one of the greatest contests ever seen in the history of boxing. Indeed, the People announced shortly after that Chris was their Boxer of the Year. Of course, it was great plaudits for him, but at the time, he didn't think he was even aware of the accolade. This desperate situation was nothing to do with front pages. Chris just didn't want that kind of publicity. This was a man, a family man in a terrible position, which Chris had been involved in. He went into his ward, and his emotions were so mixed up, he said. He was lying there in bed, still in a coma, with a quarter of his skull missing. Chris said his very soul shuddered. The extent of Michael Watson's injuries had a devastating impact on Chris. Michael was in a coma for a month, and when he came out of that, he needed incontinence underpants. Details like that just tore Chris apart. Other boxers have suffered very similar injuries, such as Rod Douglas, and fully recovered. But the signs did not appear good for Watson. Chris was very low, dejected. He just didn't realise how much it had affected him until John Regan pointed out that he'd hardly said a word for months. Mentally coming to terms with having done that to a person isn't something that is easy to explain. Living with it, well, Chris said it wasn't good at all. It was a horrible experience. Chris said, I was in touch with my human being, and it could not have been more exposed. It was so raw. He also went on to say, at the risk of stating the obvious, I didn't mean to do it. This was a mother's son. There was a mother out there whose world had been turned upside down. That was very difficult for me to live with. Looking back, I can see that I was probably severely traumatised. So many factors compounded my turmoil. Small things that you wouldn't think mattered. For example, Watson was one of the most handsome men I had ever seen. Now he was crippled, and it was my punches that had done that, and I had to live with that. Chris also said, I did try to help on a practical level with Watson's predicament. I took part in an auction to raise funds where I ended up buying most of the lots. I also sparred with Chris Pyatt to raise funds. I would like to also take this opportunity, he said, to apologise to Chris. When we were sparring, I hit him in the face when hands were down. It was done in jest, but in hindsight, he was right. You should always treat another world champion with respect. He also said, I noticed that although Watson was a people's champion, there was no denying that many of those people did not come forward when he needed them the most. Chris said he felt like saying, he was your champion. Help the man now, he is in a terrible position. Oh, yes, they sent the condolences and commiserations, but That just wasn't enough. They should have got together, raised some funds. It was all talk. Chris said he's seen talkers all his life, and in his mind, he felt like he'd done what he could do to help at the situation. He also said later in a television interview, for anyone who's going to call this sport, go and have a look at Michael Watson. This is not sport. It's a blood business. Yes, it is brutal. Yes, it is barbaric. Surely my detractors who snapped at my Mugs game comments could no longer disagree with me. But matters only got worse. He came back from a holiday and picked up the newspaper at an airport. An edition of the now defunct Today, and the front page quoted Watson talking about Chris's visit to see him, with a banner headline saying, "I never wanted him at my bedside." When Chris read that, his heart sank, and he thought, I'm finished with him. But that was a knee-jerk reaction. One of his deepest wishes is for Michael to absolutely make a full recovery, and of course, that's what happened. Chris contemplated retiring after that second Watson fight. It was only natural. He never wanted to be put in that position ever again. But if he didn't fight, that would eliminate the possibility of it happening inside the ring again. For him, the buzz of boxing had gone. However, he didn't retire. But why was that? Chris said, it was a simple equation. A matter of money. I couldn't quit because of money. And I said this loud and clear to the press at the time. I needed to earn money for my family. My objective was still to raise my standard of living and my profile. Of course, many people in the boxing world have always said Chris Eubank was never the same after that Watson fight. And going into Chris's story, I think you can understand why and totally agree that was probably the case. At the time, Chris was the champion of the world. He'd beaten fighters who no one believed he would beat. And to many, well, he was invincible. Prior to 1992, he said his will, resolve and his conviction was so strong, he had what he called Godspeed. This was a subconscious feeling that Providence was on his side, a deep-rooted yet peripheral faith that things would work out for the best in both his life and his career. It was just this subliminal aura that he said he had. When you keep on winning as much as Chris had done, you just felt it was his God-given right. No one was going to beat him. That was what got him through those early championship fights with Nigel, Benn and the fight with Anthony Logan. Of course, he knew that you had to train fanatically for each and every bout, but this was coupled with the sense that if he contested truthfully, he's going to be okay. Now, obviously, we've just told the story of the second Michael Watson fight and the aftermath and the effect he's had on Chris, but there was also another incident that took place around this time as well, which maybe is not really well known, and it's one taken from his autobiography that I'm going to go through with you guys, because I feel like this is something that, one, I didn't know myself, and two, probably not many people know unless they've read his autobiography, and I think it's a significant moment which probably didn't help the way Chris was at the time. So the story goes that Chris was heading along the A23 in his Range Rover towards Gatwick Airport for a flight to Jamaica. Also in the car with him were his brothers Peter and Simon, plus a friend of his. They were travelling within the speed limit, driving at 60 miles an hour. Now at one point, he looked across to his left very briefly, but when he looked back ahead, the car just seemed to nudge itself to the right in a swerve. Obviously, Chris reacted and tried to pull the car back straight, but in doing so, the vehicle began to zigzag. The weave got wider and wider as the car began to career out of control. Instinctively, Chris put his foot on the brake pedal, but nothing happened. The car was now out of control, and he was still doing 60 miles an hour, seemingly with no brakes. He noticed roadworks going on ahead by a bridge. Chris was swerving violently now as they pulled level towards the roadworks. The car dived off the road. The surface was coated in a very slippery but light mud, so he couldn't control the direction, and the speed didn't decrease. There were piles of bricks arranged very neatly along these roadworks, and directly behind one of the stacks was a lone workman. Even though Chris was desperately trying to steer the car to safety, they were badly out of control. Although it happened so fast, he could see this workman was looking directly at him, watching Chris and the car veer towards him. He was just standing there, stock still, frozen to the spot with shock. Chris didn't even hit the horn. He hit the bricks absolutely in the centre of the pile. And as he did, so was the workman looking right at him in the eye. And Chris was looking right at him too. There was then a massive thud when the car hit the pile, which showered bricks everywhere. The car went into a roll, and as it did, Chris's door flew open and broke off against the ground. Chris was completely exposed in the door opening and not wearing a seatbelt. The force of the roll dumped him out of the vehicle, which carried on rolling, leaving him behind on the ground. He watched the car, which seemed to be in very slow motion, roll once more before smashing into the bridge supports. Even then, when this awful event was unfolding, there was the possibility that what Chris says, his Godspeed, was protecting him again. Chris had nosebleeds, he'd had cut eyes, but when a car rolls and the door opens, gently leaving you on the ground as a person with not a scratch, you can't not think, but Providence and Godspeed is playing a part in how you've managed that. However, at this point, Chris had totally forgotten about the workman. He thought he'd dived out of the way, and he was thinking, are his brothers still in the car? It had smashed into the bridge with frightening force, and he knew Peter wasn't wearing a belt either. So he got up, and he went and checked himself. He patted himself down to see if he was okay, then he ran over to the car. Simon had been wearing a seatbelt, and he didn't have a scratch, so he helped him out. His friend was reasonably okay as well. Although Peter had been in the back seat, the force of the crash had thrown him around the cabin, and he was lodged between their headrests with heavy bruising and a badly cut eye. They helped him out of the car, and they limped to the side. It was at that moment that the dreadful realisation hit Chris that the car had hit the workman. He was just lying there in the road. Chris ran over to him and said, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" But the workman didn't move or say anything back. His eyes were just open, and Chris could see flickers of life in them, but he wasn't moving. He was conscious, but he couldn't even move his eyeballs. That shattered Chris. He was instantly torn to pieces. His cherished Godspeed was seemingly in tatters around him. Everything was not going to be okay. The devastation was absolute and sickening. He ran out to the road to stop people in their cars to try and get an ambulance. He was distraught, and as he ran around trying to get help, he was crying, moaning. There was a security fella who was with him at the time, and he was chasing Chris around the car saying, "There's nothing you can do. He's gone." Chris said, "No, wait for the ambulance." Chris couldn't believe his words. To him, they were unacceptable. It couldn't be true. At the scene, they breathalyzed Chris, and obviously, it was completely uncontaminated. You've got to remember, at this point, he's a world champion, and he hadn't had a drink since he was a teenager. Chris felt almost as if he was having an internal conversation with himself. He was questioning himself. He was questioning that Godspeed and that Providence. Suddenly, the foundations of his world were very brittle. He could bleed. He could fall. He has fallen. The problem is that once you start thinking in this way, it's like an insidious seed that grows relentlessly. It's like the chink in the armour that can never be closed. At that point in the police station, Chris said his Godspeed had been lost. Although it felt like it had gone forever, it actually hadn't, but to a degree, this particular accident took away some of his Godspeed permanently, and actually added to what people talked about after the Watson saga, that his finishing instinct also went with this. He was quizzed for 5 hours, and later investigations cleared Chris of any negligent wrongdoing, finding him guilty of only driving without due care and attention. Looking back, Chris said, "I could have completely exonerated myself at the time by not letting the police take my car. Had I kept the car in my possession, I would have had it independently tested and the results would have shown brake failure. But I just didn't think of this. Everything was happening too fast. It was so traumatic. Plus, there was another later incident when the brakes failed again, causing him to hit some bollards in the King's Road, Brighton. He should have got out of the car and walked away, leaving it there." The effects of this car crash on Chris, along with the Michael Watson incident, well, they were just utterly devastating for him. The media were predictably scathing. However, their opinion was never something that was going to damage Chris deeply, but it was still there. It was his own thoughts, it was his own perspective that caused him so much pain. Many members of the public were similarly unsympathetic towards him. Details began to emerge that compounded Chris's despair, and there was one aspect in particular that he just couldn't get out of his head. The man who died had decided to stay and keep on working while his colleagues had gone for a break. That man's diligence had cost him his life. Chris found that profoundly distressing. Initially, it wasn't something he could cope with. It was too heavy. He took a man's life by accident. But what he said truly desolated him was that he took a mother's son. And following on from this particular incident, there was one particular night, about 18 months after the crash, and he was driving along Western Road in Brighton with his window down. There was a man walking past, and when he saw it was Chris, he leaned towards the open window and said, "Murdering cunt." Chris said, "In my life, there've been two low points, the crash itself and that statement. Those words levelled me," he said. "It was like a wrecking ball to my heart, truly destructive. I went straight around to my friend Gay's house, but didn't tell her what had actually happened because I felt so low. She said to me, 'It looks like you're going to break down,' and burst out crying. I said no and kept quiet all night." Chris also said when that complete stranger said those words, the effect on him was catastrophic. They were spoken with such malice. It was such a viciously unkind thing to say. This incident was an accident, but to that man, it was probably no more derogatory than calling Chris a tosser or whatever. But those two words annihilated him. Said with such a swear word, it ripped him to shreds. He knew it had been an accident, but he still had to live with what happened. As Chris has said before, acceptance of any situation is the key. But it wasn't until maybe 1995 that he could accept this circumstance. He's heard those words since, but they didn't have the same impact because he grew to be accepting of the accident, although he stated quite diligently that he'll never get over it. Knowing that his whole motivation and chief desire is acceptance, well, you can then understand how damaging that the statement was to him. At the time, he still had this public persona where people were going along with what the media told them to think of him, that he was an arrogant, gloated person on all the trappings of success and that rubbish. But no one understood that Chris was a human being. No one had embraced Chris except his wife, Ronnie, and a few other close friends. And remember, this was 1992. He'd beaten Watson, he'd beaten Benn, both of them being people's champions. This had increased his sense of isolation at a time when he craved acceptance. It was an accident, but he was shunned. Acceptance could never have been further away. Furthermore, during that time, the word murderer was sprayed on the walls around his house 4 times. Each incident for him was very disturbing. It was very ugly and incredibly upsetting, and it was that sort of abuse that was calamitous for his mental well-being. So for all those who didn't know these stories, it does give you a real insight, doesn't it, into why things really changed for him in the ring and why it was so evident that he just wasn't the same fighter he once was, not just because of what happened with Michael Watson, but this incident outside of the ring, the things he said about it, the things that he had to deal with. You can totally understand why his mindset changed. Now, he was reasonably able to put some of these awful recent events out of his mind for his next fight against Fulani Sugarboy Malinga in Birmingham. He had to put all his energy and concentration into training. He couldn't allow himself to be distracted. While he had considered retiring in the aftermath of the second Watson fight, the thought never crossed his mind after the crash. The two were totally different circumstances. One is an accident, and the other was business. There was never any comparison between the two. Boxing was Chris's livelihood. He trained at Brighton's Metropole Hotel, and again opened up the sessions to make money for local children's charities. He wasn't scared of what might happen in the ring this time. The situation was helped by the pre-fight cordial meeting. He called him Mr. Malinga, and he was reciprocal in his politeness. In the fight itself, Chris took things quite gingerly at first, but gradually built up the momentum and dropped him in the 5th round. He dragged himself back up, and he didn't go on to stop him, causing a lot of people ringside to murmur about Chris's apparent apprehension. Chris didn't feel consciously that it was a problem. And also, to be fair, Sugarboy Malinga, although Chris had only rated him a 5, this actual Zulu warrior showed his true willpower and launched a fierce attack towards Chris in the latter stages of the fight. Chris withstood the punishment and won the fight in 12 rounds on points. Chris was also having plans drawn up for an extensive wall to be built around his home at this time. When the Malinga decision was announced in his favour, he looked over to John Regan at ringside, went down on one knee, and he said to him, "That's my wall paid for." Afterwards, they celebrated an excellent bout together at the post-fight party. However, although externally it seemed it was business as usual for Chris, there had been indeed a tidal wave of change in his career. Simply put, post-Watson, he'd lost the instinct to finish a fight. Gary Newbon found himself being criticised when he asked Chris if he had lost the killer instinct after his fight against Watson. Chris felt the criticism was harsh. He was only using a phrase, which is a boxing term. But that being said, Chris tries not to use it because people do not seem able to see words as intended, namely going in for the finish to win the fight. For example, for a fighter who was criticised for not stopping opponents, it's worth noting that 25 of Chris's 52 opponents didn't actually last a distance in his career. Some people in the media used to insinuate that Chris actually didn't train enough. Chris said that was absolute nonsense. He just chose not to make the extent of his regime particularly public. Aside from them open training sessions, people within the business actually knew the truth. The thing is, once you have a date for a bout, specific training usually begins 8 weeks before, sometimes even 12. From that moment, for a fighter, you focus not on the week of the fight or the day or even the hour. The focus begins on the day the fight is announced. That approach had to be placed with great delicacy because if a fighter's momentum was ever even 1 hour askew, you could get beaten. And the key was this: the most important day of training is the day they announce the fight. If you do not start properly, you'll not be able to catch up later. Knowing that the fight starts on day one, the first phase would be conditioning for a fighter, and at this stage you'd not be sparring at all. For Chris, Brighton was the ideal place for him for the early morning road work before the gym. He used to sometimes run up the very steep steps at the cliff tops, which was pretty easy for him. Hill running, though he didn't like it at all, there was a place called Bear Road, which was just the longest uphill slog that you've probably ever seen. Usually Chris had run, but sometimes cycle. Beach running sessions were also a real test, he said. The large pebbles on Brighton Beach sucked the stamina out of your legs within 50 yards. You could almost instantly feel the lactic acid building up. The late morning or early afternoon was gym time, often at Barry Hearn's Matchroom Gym in Romford, and latterly at his own home gym. Chris's routine would consist of 15 minutes of stretching, warming up, then 50 minutes of shadow boxing, but not just using his fists, using his feet and body to develop agility. Much of this would be done in front of mirrors, what Chris liked to call the more fanciful boxing. Then he'd do between 3 and 6 rounds of 3 minutes each on the heavy bag, moving it around, playing with it. Then 3 rounds on the pads. Ronnie rarely directed the pad work. Chris told him where he wanted him to place the pads because he had certain shots in mind that he wanted to perfect. He said the pads were great for target practice, accuracy and power. My need was to train for power because I naturally had the accuracy. What I needed to achieve was landing a punch which would have a long-term effect. Namely, it will manifest itself 3 or 4 rounds later. If you keep hitting someone with good shots to the body, maybe only twice a round, 4 rounds later, it will catch up to them and break them down. Then he would do 6 rounds of skipping, but without rest. He would skip straight through the 4-minute clock on the wall. Then it was sit-ups. Although Chris can't deny that sit-ups are very important for the abdomen, he would only do 50 or 60 repetitions twice a day. His experience taught him that there was nothing more effective than taking actual body shots. Just as he'd learnt in New York, you would leave your body exposed and tell your sparring partner to work on it with full-blooded punches to really harden your stomach. It wasn't about having hard abdominal muscles, it was about immunity. You could do 1,000 sit-ups a day, but if a fighter hits you correctly, you're going to crumble. The only way to gain that immunity was by taking hundreds of shots to the body. And then this was where sparring came in. Throughout Chris's career, he says he probably sparred more than any other fighter he knows. He would start to spar about 2 weeks into the training schedule. The training would change slightly to half an hour of shadow boxing, between 3 and 12 rounds of sparring, then skipping, speedball and sit-ups. For a championship fight, he would spar usually 125 rounds. Nothing was more important than sparring, he said. When you haven't sparred for a month or 2, you go in there, the guy throws a punch and you instinctively squint. Within a week of intense sparring, he throws the same punch and you don't even blink. You stop flinching and you move. The first day of sparring was always very painful, and Chris says he never enjoyed it because he used to take a lot of jabs on his forehead, which would bruise for about 2 days. He said, you can't wait for the bruising to subside. The point of the exercise was to work through the damage to develop immunity. Sparring was just fantastic when you were in the thick of it, he said. You would come out of some real tear-ups with no bruises, no pain. At worst, a slightly sore jawbone. If you took heavy punishment in sparring, then Chris knew he would be okay in the fight. When you're having it all your own way in sparring, then the championship fight will be, in his experience, a very, very hard one. Chris said he always picked his sparring partners. Depending on the fighter, he would say to Ronnie what was needed. For Chris, it was a simple equation: find the closest fighter in style to the forthcoming opponent. Don't spar with a technically skilled man if you're about to fight a powerhouse. Another rule that Chris had was vehemently adhered to was that his sparring sessions were an unconstrained free-for-all. When he first met a new sparring partner, he would always give them the same briefing: protect yourself at all times and allow me no favours. Outside of the ring, he'd shake hands, philosophise a little and offer them advice about the dogged business. But while they were sparring, Chris would try and take them out, and that was his objective. Subsequently, about 80% of them would be sent home within 3 or 4 days, cut and bruised up. If the sparring partner wasn't good enough, then they would get an unmerciful beating. But if they were good, then Chris would keep them and take the physical punishment for as long as he had to. It was very intense, but that was the only way he knew. That was the method that Maximo showed him. Nothing personal, but if you're not good enough, sorry, you have to go. Chris also talked about what it was like the day of the fight, his regime, and he goes into great detail in his autobiography. So I'm going to read some of the extracts from that for you guys to sort of truly understand what his perception was of a fight going into it. He said, on the day of the fight, I was as meticulous as during the build-up. For a start, I had to have complete harmony amongst all my camp. If there were any arguments happening, I told everyone to make sure I didn't find out or even sense it. If I did, they would be sent home. No one ever argued with me. When I gave a decision, that was it. It was finished. Breakfast on the day would be lots of boiled eggs, toast and cornflakes. Hot water and lemon peel was my drink because caffeine raised your anxiety levels, which was highly undesirable. You needed to remain calm. My temper was pure. I slept well, didn't use any substances and drank no alcohol. I didn't even think about such things. While I was at the hotel before the fight, I would walk around, followed by all the security, and go to meet the public, sign autographs, and chat with them. That boosted my spirits. I also always went shopping because that would lift my morale as well. People used to worry about me being distracted, but it was actually just the opposite. These routines kept me relaxed and buoyant. Besides, the alternative was clock watching in the hotel room, and that could actually be stressful. The precision of my preparation continued right up to the moment I stepped into the ring, he said. It was not enough for the camp around me to be free of arguments. My room also had to be immaculate. By that, I mean picture perfect. I did not allow anyone else to tidy up, not even the roommates. I would send everybody out and be left alone. When I would spend time making sure the quilt was devoid of even the slightest ripple, like a piece of slate, the curtains would be inch perfect, rigid as a marble pillar. I would check each drawer individually, and on several occasions found some slightly opened or had dents, which meant that it was not exactly flush with the cupboard. I needed everything to be ordered. It would play on my mind if the smallest detail was incorrect. The same also applied to my shorts, my laces, everything. I boxed in yellow shorts from the Malinga fight in 1992. I had fanatical routines for lacing the boots. People would lace them laboriously for me, but it never seemed to be correct. The thinking behind such perfection was not superstition. If everything was in place in the hotel room, then everything was in place in my mind. I would think, the room is done, it is correct, so everything in a compartment and is clean and is in order. What I cannot afford is for my mind to be out of balance. If during the entrance to the ring for a world title defence, I had realised I'd forgotten to push a drawer completely closed, I would have thought about turning around and going back to the hotel. Karen, his wife, has seen it from their early days together. Even the bedsit which they lived in when they first met was like a pristine show flat. The need for order also applied to his relationships as well. He couldn't enter the arena, never mind the ring, if he had wronged somebody. There was one occasion, an incident the night before a fight in Germany that nearly cost him dear. There was a knock on the door, and it was a fella called Jess Harding, a heavyweight fighting for Barry Hearn. He had come all the way from England and had brought him a good luck card. The problem was, the humour between Ronnie and Chris was so cutting so hard that outsiders sometimes found it difficult to stomach. Jess gave Chris the card and said, "I've bought this from England for you from my son." Chris replied, "Thanks," and threw it in the bin. He didn't even open it. He had intended this to be a biting joke, but Jess didn't see the humour. He was devastated, and tears welled up in his eyes. That was his son's card. He left the room without speaking, leaving Chris horrified. He ran out of the room but couldn't find him, so he spent half an hour scouring the hotel trying to track him down. When he did, he sat with him for 2 hours explaining that it was a joke and that he had meant no harm. Eventually, Jess understood, and Chris says he still has that card today. In hindsight, it was a very good thing to happen to him the night before a fight because it made him perform better, because he'd upset a kind man. Otherwise, it would have plagued him. He had to right that wrong. He had to apologise. The performance in the ring that night was also an apology to Jess too. But the obsession with correctness actually made them laugh as well, because often he would take a white towel, cut the traditional diamond out of the centre and place it over his head. The problem was, bits of fluff would catch him on his trimmed hair and his head, and it would look like he was covered in snowflakes. So if you look closely in certain fights of Chris's, after Ronnie had taken the towel off in the ring, you can actually see he's in the process of giving it extra large with the pose in front of thousands of fight fans, who were usually anti-Eubank fans, of course, and if you could read his lips, he's actually saying, "Ronnie, get the fluff out. Ron, have you got it all out?" Chris also said about being in the ring, "I never wore underpants, just the 2 cups to protect him. If I was really unlucky, when I vaulted into the ring, the shorts would ride up my crevice, for want of a better word. I'd be strutting inside the ropes, snarling at the crowd, puffing my chest out and giving it the full warrior routine, whilst secretly trying to pull the shorts out of my crevice." The difficulty was, by now he had gloves on, of course, so it was more of a nifty swipe around the buttocks, bouncing the gloves on his cheeks in vain, hoping that the shorts would slip down. He'd have thousands of people screaming at him, "Look at him, strutting like a lion. Who does he think he is?" When all the time all Chris was thinking was, "I wish these frigging shorts would dislodge themselves from my ass." So at this point in time, Chris was a world champion with 5 defences to his name and, of course, substantial wealth starting to accumulate. The relentless defences of his title continued with the fight against John Jarvis, and for this, Chris was in fine form, giving the spectators the full Monty. He knocked him out in the 3rd round, and he was pleased, not least because it meant he could go home to his wife Karen. On the 27th of June 1992, he travelled to the resort of Quinta do Lago in Portugal to fight the American tactician Ron Essett in an open-air bout. They stayed at the ultra-luxurious Quinta do Lago Country Club for his training. The night of the fight was hot and very tiring, so the 12-round unanimous points decision for Chris was, in his words, extremely demanding. There was a near mishap when they realised that they hadn't actually even called him correctly. Essett was in the ring, and he was still on his way to the arena. Back in Hove, he'd just moved into a large house which he'd bought the previous winter, but spent months renovating. 18 months later, they bought the house next door and joined the 2 gardens. So, they had 1.5 acres of residence. Now, we've heard that cliche saying in boxing, haven't we, about how it's 80% mental, 20% physical, or whatever the percentages are. But that's so true. A fight is always a mental battle before the actual bout, and one of the most unsettling pre-fight situations Chris says he ever came across was when he fought Tony Thornton in Glasgow. He was a good American fighter with sound pedigree, strong chin, big punch, and had been in there with some of the top names. Many insiders at the time likened him to Marvin Hagler. He was given a 7 by Chris beforehand. However, what really bugged Chris and what had him flustered and unsettled for some weeks beforehand was this. He was a postman. Benn's ferocity and venom he could accept. Watson's derogatory remarks he could live with. But this was a postman. This was singularly the most annoying mental obstacle that Chris had to overcome in his entire career. And why, would you ask? He said, because he was still a postman at the time. Despite challenging me for the world title, he was going to be persistent, methodical and relentless. His job demanded he behave in this manner. This thought really stayed in my head and upset my equilibrium for a long time because persistence like that can break your spirit. Whatever unsettles you as a boxer, unless you come to be accepting of it 9 times out of 10, you're likely to lose the fight. And as in life, you must accept your position. Chris was normally very good at accepting his situation, but the fact that this guy was a postman troubled him immensely for 6 weeks, and that hurdle proved very, very hard for him to overcome. Tony Thornton then exacerbated Chris's unease when he came into town by actually admitting that he had suffered injury worries with one hand, before going on to say on national television, well, if the hand is going to go, it may as well be on Chris Eubank's jaw. Chris was the world champion. Where's the respect? Chris was particularly annoyed and concerned with his attitude, so he knew that he had a fight on his hands. When you've got a fighter who respects you, you inherently have him under control because he will respect you in the ring. But what Chris needed was for the opponent to respect him for 3 minutes. And he'd got it. He'd got the fight. But with Thornton, he didn't get that. Fortunately, Chris finally came to the acceptance of Tony Thornton being a postman about a week before the fight. Once he overcame that obstacle, it was okay. But that being said, on the night of the fight, he didn't have his usual yellow shorts, which he always wore. He only had a red pair. That's something, as you've heard earlier, that can unsettle him. But he practiced the philosophy of putting the positive before the negative. Something, of course, that is absolutely quintessential to anybody's entire life. He told himself, there's no luck involved here. This is about technique, work, persistence, being dogged, training, expertise, and the art that he'd been learning for years, and of course his resolve. This was not about the colour of his shorts. Ultimately, the hardest man wins a fight. Thornton tried to go one better and he actually turned up in a kilt, which wasn't very well received by the Scottish locals. Boxing for Chris, he said, has never been about gimmicks. It's actually about fighting ability and resolve. And in the actual fight with Thornton, Chris used hit and run tactics in as much as Tony Thornton was all pressure. And it's exactly what he expected. Chris used his boxing ability and skill, along with the side-to-side foot movement, and by round 10, he had the fight won. For the last 2 rounds, he just stayed away from Tony Thornton, circled the ring, running from danger. Of course, the crowd don't like that, but he said after the fight, I may have had to run for those last 2 rounds, but the objective is to win. The aim is not to show that I am a hard man and knock him out at the risk of my victory. People can call you names, but the idea is to win. After all, Chris was a fighter by trade, one of the hardest professions on the planet, so it didn't make sense. He simply had his eye on the objective, which was to win. If that meant beating him for the first 10 rounds, then running for 2, then so be it. And that's what he did with Tony Thornton, despite all his earlier reservations and concerns. He won, and he was now 33-0. His next fight in the November was against Paraguayan Juan Carlos Jimenez at Manchester's GMEX. He was his 5th opponent in under 10 months. Jimenez was a capable boxer with a strong 35-5-3 record. He'd actually had Roberto Duran off his feet in an early knockdown, so he knew he couldn't take this guy for granted. Again, having said that though, when he got in there, Jimenez punched him so lightly that he was never going to get hurt. Chris's jab was constantly in his face. Jimenez was probably in his twilight years at the point Chris faced him, but he was a strong fighter. And Chris was a strong champion, so he eventually won the fight on points, but was again criticised for not finishing his opponent in more style. Chris personally felt that the bout was most notable for his extravagant showmanship, the vault, the music, the prowling around the ropes, whipping the crowd into a frenzy. They were standing on the top of the chairs, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the fighters. Now, despite his recent difficulties, his detractors kept accusing Chris of taking easy fights. His next opponent, Lindell Holmes, a former IBF world champion, told the UK's press he had come to take the title back to America. He didn't, of course, although it took Chris the full 12 rounds to beat him on points. He was a mature, experienced boxer and naturally gifted. He still had to beat the man they put in front of him. It wasn't a walkover. They made it out like it was going to be. He trained very hard again, this time opening the doors to his gym in his childhood stomping ground of Peckham, just 2 miles from the Dulwich Hospital where he was born. Then less than 3 months later, he took on Ray Close in Glasgow at the Scottish Exhibition Centre. Beforehand, he was walking with Ronnie along Brighton seafront one day, when he saw this crane that was set up for bungee jumping. As he walked past, he could almost hear the crane saying to him, "You haven't got the bottle to do me, have you?" Chris continued walking, but this voice kept on coming at him, "You haven't got the bottle." So he turned around, paid his money, went up, and jumped off head first, arms outstretched. Chris said, "Sometimes things grab me like that. If I feel it is a challenge to face, I have to take it on. Ronnie said I was mad and thought I was unprofessional to do it. Chris, ever the person to create controversy, caused much consternation when he booked himself into a Nuffield private hospital for a circumcision only 2 weeks before the Ray Close fight. People told him that after such an operation, you've got to avoid combat sports for some time. Chris wasn't interested. Over the years, he said he studied philosophies on the subject and decided long ago to have the operation. For him, it was simply a matter of hygiene. When he was in the operating theatre, he insisted on no anaesthetic, as he wanted to be fully aware of what they were doing down there to make sure everything was as it should be. He even got them to place a mirror near his waist so he could see and observe. Ronnie Davis was with him, and at one point, Chris said it was so fascinating that I said, "Hey Ronnie, check this out." Of course, Ronnie didn't seem too keen to look what was going on. Shortly after, they were in his office, and he was still extremely sore from that operation. They'd given him this cream to soothe the post-op tenderness. So, in Chris's words, he got the old man out and applied the cream. John Regan was there and said, "Remind me not to ask you for help the next time my lips are chafed." For the close fight, Chris just put 2 cups on, and everything was fine, he said. No problem. Ray Close had a solid record and was known for his diligence in the ring. It proved to be the case on the night. He had such a workmanlike attitude that it actually annoyed Chris. His actual punches were like being hit by a kid. Like, he never hurt Chris. In fact, each time he punched, he made this really loud, rasping grunt, which, Chris said, to be honest, caused me more irritation than his actual shots. Ray's ability to keep a very high work rate was exceptional. But unfortunately for him, he was a light puncher. It was never about work rate after the second Watson fight. Chris's aim was to hit the man 2 or 3 times around with big shots, proper jabs and so on. Then they would catch up with him in the later rounds. He concentrated on every shot being hard, not just throwing hundreds of punches for the sake of it. Although he won a lot of fights on points, he didn't build his score through a sheer volume of shots. Nonetheless, by the end of the 12th, the decision was given as a draw. Some said he would have won, but not for an uppercut which poleaxed him in the penultimate round. His legs and eyes were gone. He was in trouble. However, Close stayed the course, and it was called a draw. Chris didn't agree, but the judges had a job to do, and they did it. Chris was immediately accepting of that, despite this being the first draw of his career. People thought Chris was going to be gutted afterwards. But why? He'd not taken Chris's belt. He'd not done enough to win, and in Chris's mind, he's still the champion of the world. Then when Chris became the world middleweight champion after beating Nigel Benn, he had to accept that lower purse just to get him in the ring. That was one of the stipulations of it. But for the rematch, Chris felt that his generosity he showed in offering Benn that second bout paid off too, but in a different way. It was the fight that everyone wanted. The media, the public, all wanted to see the rematch. Benn had fought back from his defeat and gone on to win the WBC belt, so this was the first time that 2 British world champions was to fight each other. The global interest was staggering. Chris found out later that the fight was screened in 60 countries and watched by over 1 billion. A combined audience of over 30 million people saw the fight in the UK alone. Immediately after the ITV News at 10, simply put, it was one of the biggest fights of all time. In the preparations for the rematch, Chris said he was overconfident. He felt like he had Benn beat. Despite what the public and fight business assumed from his persona, this was probably the only fight where Chris actually was overconfident. John Regan has since said that he was worried when he saw how relaxed he was in the hotel room before the fight. But Chris said he was so confident. He said, "In fact, I had WBO and WBC champions sewn into my shorts and robe beforehand, even though I was trying to win Benn's WBC belt. The contest still has to happen, and you have to allow for the passion of the man, which in Benn's case was fierce combined with his ability. By being so presumptuous, Chris, it was playing a very dangerous game indeed." Looking back in hindsight, he said it's easy to see why Benn was so motivated. Apart from their mutual history, someone else said the specific circumstances leading up to the fight wound him up still more. At one American press conference, Chris psychologically slapped him around. All the middleweights and super middleweight champions were at this press conference. This was at a time when You had the likes of Gerald McClellan saying he was the baddest motherfucker on the planet. Benn was getting beaten up in this conference, and he eventually got so angry, he stood up and said, "I'm going back to England, and I'm going to train for this fucker." He was so fused. Chris had got to him. Walking out to an audience of 43,000 people at Old Trafford, Chris said, was absolutely overwhelming. It was just a seething mass of faces. They had all come to watch Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn. Chris said, "This took my focus away, probably the only time in my career that I really didn't have my focus intact. Normally, I was totally tunnel-visioned, but for this fight, my heart wasn't pounding. I was distracted by the sheer volume of spectators. Also, as champion in my own right, I knew I was more emotionally intelligent than Benn, but what I couldn't have known was just how fused he was. He was wired." This focus within Benn made him much more calculating, and that made him even more dangerous. That had always been his weakness before. His brutality exploded without prior thought, but now he was combining this venom with forethought. It was a potent formula. The second Benn fight was, of course, an occasion more than a fight. Chris said he felt victory was a foregone conclusion, and explains why he just wasn't as focused as he might have been. Benn, of course, was up for the bout, but Chris just didn't have the same focus he had during their previous encounter. For that first fight, it was Chris's chance to honour himself. This was the acid test. But for Benn, in the second fight, he was already champion of the world. He'd proven himself. It takes both men being completely psyched up to produce a legendary fight like the first Benn fight or the Watson second fight. The fight itself was a maul. It was nowhere near as explosive or memorable as the first encounter. Reg Gutteridge said as Chris entered the ring, "The ego has landed." The only highlight of note was probably perhaps that. It's the only fight you'll ever see where one fighter kicks the other man in the head and doesn't get disqualified as well. Even so, when the decision was announced as a draw, no one could quite believe it, except Chris. However, his view appeared to be in a clear minority. Although the media made much of the supposed public dissatisfaction with that decision, especially in the actual arena, when Chris talked to people in the streets, half think that he lost and the other half say that he won. Personally, Chris said he think with 2 world title belts at stake, neither fighter actually did enough to prize the other title away. For that, there needed to be a clear victor, and there was a lot of talk about the points deducted for Benn's low blows. That discussion is a non-starter for Chris. You have to abide by the rules and regulations of the game, and if you don't, as he found out to his cost against Dan Sherry, you're going to have points deducted. Bear in mind a low blow can really damage your groin area and leave you very unsettled. If you are then finished off in the immediate aftermath, the opponent will have gained an unfair advantage by that illegal punch. Now Chris said, "I'm not saying Benn intended to throw this particular shot. He doesn't think he did, but in general, fighters can learn to throw a few tricks. Benn had to have that point deducted. If that pulled the scorecards back to a draw, then so be it. You make the wrong move and you pay the price." The thing is, later on down the line, Chris, even now, openly admits that Benn probably should have got that win. Initially, that was his reaction. But as years have gone by, water under the bridge has passed. Chris Eubank openly admits, now, in 2025, that he felt Nigel Benn should have got the decision. At the time, unbeknown to the public, a draw for Chris was actually a tremendous result. It was better than a win in many ways. And why do you think that? Well, simply because his contract with boxing promoter Don King didn't allow for a draw, and therefore he was totally freed of any legally binding association. If he had won or lost, the paths were then mapped out for Chris, but no one had actually conceived of a draw happening. Barry Hearn took some stick from Don King, who said, "Yes, a draw, but you knew what we meant," to which Barry said, "There was no clause regarding the draw. We have no obligations." Chris said to Barry after the fight, "What does a draw mean?" Barry replied, "It means you are not tied down to anyone, and you've got to do it all over again." The last thing Chris wanted to do in his career was to be tied to Don King. Although Don King can take you very far and get you the opportunities you crave, at the same time, he's taken away too much control. Your career may very well end with someone like a Don King. He didn't know whether it was his mother praying or the providence intervening that it was scored a draw, but for Chris, it was a blessed result. When Chris arrived home after the second Benn fight, his wife Karen revealed that on the morning of the bout, she'd actually received a death threat against Chris. A poison pen letter had been left in the letterbox saying, "Your husband will die in the ring tonight." She since explained to Chris that it was quite an awful experience, as she decided not to let him know, but obviously had to involve the special branch and the authorities. Barry Hearn was intimately involved with the operation, and Chris said it sounds as though it was quite a big deal. Chris knew absolutely nothing about it until after the event. The only slight oddity that Chris noticed was when they were walking to the ring. He was behind Ronnie and he saw a lot of huge men, maybe 20 or 30 around his entourage, all with earpieces and wire microphones. Even Barry had one. Chris just assumed at the time it was all part of the razzmatazz, the showmanship, so he thought nothing more of it. Karen watched that fight at home on the television in the kitchen and was, of course, worried sick, waiting for Chris to suddenly fall over in the ring from sniper fire. Had he known about that death threat, he may still have fought because he had all organised that whole protection. No matter what you would have put in front of Chris at the time, he probably would have taken on the situation. Now, at the start of February 1994, Chris travelled to Germany to fight Graziano Rocchigiani, who was unbeaten in 35 fights. He was not the mandatory challenger, that was Ray Close, whom he would fight again shortly. However, the WBO agreed to this bout first. Earlier in Chris's career, as he said, he jested that there was a formula for getting on in boxing. Never fight a southpaw or anyone over 6 foot or face an unbeaten record. Rocchigiani was all three, a very big man, and fighting in his own backyard. The media in England said that this would be Chris's burial ground, highlighting his impeccable record, size, style, and the fact that Chris had had back-to-back world title draws. He was something of a local folk hero too, notorious for his bar brawler reputation and a recent prison sentence. Even though this was Chris's 13th defence, many observers felt it could be a step too far for him. Chris felt it might not be able to knock him out, but he knew he could win. He said that when he had beaten Chris, he would get married to his girlfriend. So they went to Berlin and were asked to do a photo shoot at the Brandenburg Gate. The showman in Chris was, of course, absolutely delighted. He wore his riding boots, jodhpurs, English jacket and carried an umbrella. When it came to taking the photographs, he was very theatrical, and he was standing there in his English gentleman clothes pointing in the direction of Hitler's bunker with a peacock strut in full flow. It's a picture you can actually see if you Google it. It's actually a great picture. Now, he knew the friction between Germany and England and how that had actually added an extra friction of tension in so many sporting contests over the years. Given it so large in Germany meant much more because of that for Chris. Now, let's not forget, this just wasn't their German boy against the Englishman. He was a black Englishman who dressed like an aristocrat. Can you imagine the sort of stuff they must have been thinking and even saying? Now, just like the bout against Cronin and so many of the other fights of Chris's, his view was actually this. He said, "The more you dislike me, the cheekier I am going to be beforehand, and the more poetically stylish I will be with my moves." By the time of the fight itself, Chris was so primed and ready. When he came to the ring, all 10,000 Germans in the Deutschlandhalle seemed to be hissing and sneering and abusing and threatening him. Bear in mind, there were only 8 of them in camp, plus a handful of British soldiers who were stationed in Germany. The only respite from the abuse was when the Germans were shouting, "Rocky, Rocky." That was their name for Rocchigiani. There was a heavy Hell's Angels presence too, and they were certainly forthcoming with their opinions. Chris didn't understand a word of German, but he didn't need to, with such torrent of abuse. It was as if they'd researched the most depraved and despicable words in their language just to hurl at him. To say they were baying for blood, well, it was a substantial understatement. So he took his time getting in the ring, such that at one point, Barry was actually worried for his personal safety as he was strutting around the ring apron. Barry said, "What on earth are you doing, Chris?" Chris explained, "Barry, I am soaking up the hate." His actual performance in the ring was of quite sterling proportion. He never dropped Rocchigiani, and he won on points, but he used a combination of light punches to the head and accurate, hard body shots, coupled with a lot of ring movement and eccentricity. He spoiled Rocchigiani's wedding plans for sure. Still, he should have kept his word to his girlfriend. One of the reasons he was able to so comprehensively be in charge of that fight was due to the genuine dislike that the fans had poured towards him. However, he regrets after the victory that he didn't have a Union Jack to put around him in the ring. Rocchigiani had dyed the Italian and German flags into his hair, and he had viewed the entire event as a highly nationalistic affair. Not having the Union Jack to hold aloft is one of the two biggest regrets in Chris's professional career, he says. The other, of course, is more serious, namely what happened to Michael Watson. So he moved on from the Rocchigiani fight, went to the second very close fight, which was in the Belfast King's Hall. Close had been at the Rocchigiani bout and claimed he saw nothing to be scared of in Chris. In the reception after that fight in Germany, Chris found Close and told him this time he would defeat him. Chris said Ray was a nice enough man, a Mormon in fact, so there was no great animosity between them compared to earlier fights. Perhaps, Chris said, it explained why both his fights against him were much lower profile than a Watson or a Benn contest. He did, however, place a £1,000 bet with Ray's manager that he would knock his man out in one round. Chris didn't arrive in Belfast until just before the weigh-in, for which he was criticised, suggesting he wasn't helping to promote the fight. After the death threat at the second Benn fight, for the second Ray Close bout, he made an extreme, albeit misinformed decision. He knew of the troubles and general atmosphere of violence, guns and bombs in Northern Ireland. At this time in the UK, the vitriol against Chris in the English media was acidic. Assuming the Irish people would equally be odious, and in light of the environment of firearms, Chris said he felt very vulnerable. He had two plain-clothed RUC officers with him as security, and it wasn't particularly unusual to have personal security around a boxer such as Chris Eubank at this time. But what was unusual was when he walked to the ring wearing a big white towel with the usual hole cut through the centre for his head, no one knew that underneath he was actually wearing a regulation bulletproof vest. The day of the fight, a soldier was killed as the troubles in Northern Ireland flared again. That afternoon, while the press were outside, assuming Chris was resting or contemplating the forthcoming bout, Ronnie and John Regan were stitching the bulletproof vest onto his towel. When it came to removing the towel and vest, Ronnie swiped them both off Chris in one movement so that no one noticed he was wearing it. At the time, it made perfect sense to Chris. He'd been unsettled by that death threat before the Benn 2 fight, so he thought it was perfectly reasonable to wear this protection. Well, Chris said he was wrong. That actually merely highlighted his ignorance of the Irish people. Their attitudes towards Chris at this point in his career was diametrically opposed to the standpoint at home. In the UK, you could taste the venom, whether it being showered with spit as you walked in the ring or vilified on almost a daily basis in the press. Chris was the arch-villain, and the people poured their scorn and hatred onto him. In Ireland, however, their opinions were the polar opposite. Yeah, they wanted Ray Close to win, of course, but they recognised Chris for what a character he was. On the night, the Belfast King's Hall was packed with 8,000 fans and the atmosphere was excellent. Matters were delayed somewhat by a bizarre occurrence when, of all things, a very small man dressed as a leprechaun threw glitter over Chris. Even though he'd been wearing his bulletproof vest, he figured that this was unlikely to be some covert assassination attempt. The glitter fell all over the canvas and took a while to sweep up. It also took some time to wipe it off Chris. Lots of it had got stuck on him because of the oil that he had on his body. Ray Close had the heart of a lion in both of the fights. He took big shots in the 10th round this time round, but kept in there. Chris even needed some butterfly stitches to his own eye afterwards. He enjoyed the crowd very much, he said. This time, in another fight, he performed sufficiently well, enough to win the judges over. After he took the decision, his team were very, very angry, but Chris felt it was a fair decision. And to the credit of the Irish at the time, as he now knows, they were very warm-hearted people, although there was some that felt the decision was wrong. There was actually no violence, no aggression towards him, or no fracas in the arena. Of course, the media were not so understanding, talking him down again, pointing out that this was his 8th 12-rounder in a row. Yet, he was still champion, 39-0. Don King was even less pleased and besieged the organisers with a flurry of immediate post-fight complaints. Afterwards, Chris said he'd be happy to fight Ray again, but this time he wanted the bout in London. Chris was also very upset when his brother Simon went and sold a story to the Sunday Mirror in July 1994. He'd been asking for some money, but his preconception of what wealth Chris had at the time was actually way beyond the reality. People from the street often think that because your name's in the newspapers that you've got millions of pounds lying around and gathering dust. At this point, Chris had already allocated much of what he had earned to developing the new house and various other interests. He was working very hard for his money and trying to secure his family's future. So he tells the story. He says, "One day, Simon came around and we had a heated discussion about money. He left and he also went out for a while. Then Simon came back and Karen answered the door. She had seen the way my brothers have been with me all over the years, and she was cross with Simon, so she said, 'Go away, leave us alone.' That was why Simon went to the newspapers," he later told Chris. He had said to Karen not to get involved with this because we were blood brothers, and it was not wise to interfere. Sometimes the third party gets pushed away and the blood remains strong. Simon has a simple way of thinking. I was very upset when I saw that story. Bear in mind all these years I've been fighting against media misconceptions of me, misinformation and such like, yet I'm here having fuel thrown onto the fire by my own family. It was very hurtful." When his father released a story to the newspaper saying the words to the effect of, "My son has found a pot of gold and left me in the gutter," Chris was easily able to forgive him. His father was illiterate and an uneducated man. He had wisdom of years but was easily wound up. People would say, "Mr. Eubank owns the Bank of England." That type of information would get into Irving's head. Chris could forgive him for that, and he understood the way his father was. Before that second Ray close fight, unbeknown to Ronnie Davis, Chris had flown out to America to visit Mike Tyson, who had recently started a 5-year jail sentence for a rape conviction. Mike and Chris did share a degree of mutual history. They didn't train at the same gym in New York, but Chris recalls seeing him on several occasions at fights. At one of his first amateur bouts, Chris remembers this young man just sitting there on a table, very quiet, just a great presence of a man. Of course, back then he was just an amateur as well, but Chris remembered him being quiet and very gentle, but still a powerful presence. Later in 1989, when he was the heavyweight champion of the world, Chris was in Versace on 67th Street and Madison Avenue when someone informed Chris that Mike was also in the store. So he took his son Christopher over and they spoke. But Mike barely spoke to Chris. He just played with Christopher. The hardship involved in the life of a fighter is why Chris says he respects Tyson. To be at the top takes a rare person, and he acknowledges that. It isn't football or rugby. It's a very tough, demanding profession. Chris also said, "I have sympathy for his predicament, but I also don't think he had too much time for me really, which is sad. So why should I speak about him? I do because he is a human being and we all need love, some more than others." And Chris would go on to talk a lot more about Mike Tyson, mainly in his autobiography, so I took some extracts from there just to give you an understanding of the relationship that got built and why Chris Eubank and Mike Tyson actually became really good friends. And he talked about Mike as a boxer. He said his approach in the ring was ferocious, vicious, intimidating, a pure knockout artist with a kill or be killed attitude. It was almost as if he was saying, "You know what I'm going to do, but try and stop me." But also, more than that, he was a learned man with regards to the four-cornered circle and the art of war. He had his own niche, and his body, weight and size suited this to such a degree that he developed into an exceptionally brilliant fighting technician. He was one of the greats, of course. They will still be talking about Muhammad Ali in 1,000 years, and they will also be talking about Mike Tyson, maybe for different reasons, although the foundation, the common denominator, will be boxing. Tyson got himself into so much trouble because of his poor conduct outside the ring. In throwing caution to the wind as regards to personal behaviour, he's nullified all his remarkable accomplishments within the ring. In that, people will highlight the bad things rather than the historical achievements. So in a sense, it's a fantastic example for his children, emphasising the pivotal importance of conduct. People often say, "Why did he do this or that?" The point is, he has a naturally short fuse. He is impulsive, and I understand this. I sympathise with him and his situation because he is an intelligent man, but his fuse is short, and he refuses to control it. Chris actually visited Mike 12 times in prison at the Indiana State Correction Center. He contacted Don King via Barry Hearn and asked for a visitor's pass. Being world champion basically means you can command some of these privileges like that. He would fly from Heathrow to New York on Concorde on the Friday, see some family in the Bronx, and then on Sunday fly to Indiana on a 737 to see Mike, then get back to England on the Monday morning. He said Mike was just a normal inmate. I didn't see any special treatment at all. You'd wait in the reception area, then when your name was called to go in, you had to put all your belongings in a locker. You then had more checks before walking down a long corridor through a metal detector, get checked again, and then at the bottom of that walkway there was another locked door. Here there was an ultraviolet machine to check that you had the appropriate security stamps, and after that you were led into the visiting room. Everybody would sit down and wait, and they would lead all the inmates out at once, including Mike. You could either go outside into a garden area where all these tables were locked down, or if it was too cold, you'd stay inside. Twice I was unable to see him, once because it had not been sanctioned by the warden, and once he had family waiting to see him. I gave them the slot and returned home. We would meet for 2 hours each time, he said. On the very first visit, I said to him, "Give me the story, short and sharp, about this Desiree Washington." And he said, "She gave me the pussy, then she put me in prison." Then he just kind of laughed. He was always very subdued when I met him, but always extremely affable as well. We had lots of conversations, but never about material goods. The discussions were always about intangibles or philosophy. He said to me, "I didn't want any of this. I didn't want all this fame and money. What I wanted was for the other guys in the gymnasium who trained next to me to say, 'Hey, that's a good fighter.'" He didn't expect the infamy, the rhetoric. All he ever wanted was to be known as a good fighter. Chris said he had a better understanding of Mike Tyson the moment he first said to him, "I only ever did this for a pat on the back in the gym." What do you say to that? It knocks you back. It was such a noble aspiration. Chris went on to say, we'd have these lengthy conversations in a room full of other inmates and visitors, but I didn't notice anyone looking over. Yes, this was 2 champion boxers sitting together in a prison room, but I never saw it like that. For me, I was in the presence of a great fighter. I wasn't remotely conscious of my championship stature. I think of myself just as you think of yourself. It's all relative. So, as I'm sitting there, in jail, I'm just an ordinary person, sitting opposite Mike Tyson, the youngest undisputed heavyweight champion ever. I said to Mike, "Do you understand that your position makes you a role model?" And he continued, "Mike, whatever you do, make sure it's positive, because if it's negative, it will be reported enormously. So be a role model in the positive. Whatever you do, it will be reported. If you step in mud, the headlines will read, 'Mike Tyson, convicted rapist, steps in mud.'" He replied, "As far as being a role model is concerned, I don't want the job. I will take a rain check. I just want to live my life." For that, I was disappointed because he has the potential to influence a lot of people, both young and old. I said, "Whether you like it or not, you are a role model. You cannot back out now." But he just wasn't interested. Now, during that rape trial, Tyson's defence raised questions about why Desiree Washington did not report the crime for a week after the alleged incident, and also why she was in that hotel room at 3 a.m. To a degree, I can sympathise with those observations. It is all about Tyson's angle on it at the time, and no one outside of that room will ever know what really happened. Apparently, it was reported that he wouldn't walk her home either. He just said to her, "Go." If that was so, then it was just plain inconsiderate. You are obviously going to put someone's back up by saying that, but in no way do I think he expected to go for prison for 3 years. Nevertheless, he is convicted as a rapist by the law of the land, and people ask me why I like Mike Tyson. It's because I know his fuse is short, and the media and other opportunists take advantage of that short fuse to make some easy money. Chris went on to say, "I'm glad I visited Mike Tyson in prison, and I've gained a considerable amount of experience and wisdom from meeting him. I have a photograph of Mike that to me shows his true self, away from all the media hype, the column inches, the frenzy and speculation. When I first had this picture developed, I gave it to my mother and said, 'Mum, pray for this man.' It is so unfortunate. You have here an ordinary guy with an extraordinary past, an extraordinary career, and extraordinary media coverage. I know that, like me, he is just a man." So it's at this point, ladies and gentlemen, we will break off for the end of part 2 of Chris Eubank's career profile. I thought it'd be really good to get that little bit in there with Tyson at the end. It was out of his autobiography. It was really interesting to understand where that picture came from. I've seen that picture on social media floating around over the past few years. I've even posted it myself. I think it's a great picture of them, together. And I think it was really good to get that insight into how that relationship developed and why it developed as well. I never knew that about Chris Eubank and the relationship with Mike Tyson, and that I visited in prison. But also it was really interesting to go through the things that happened in his life, the death threats he received, the car accident when a man was killed. That was something that really explains, alongside the end of the second Michael Watson fight and the injuries Watson sustained, why Chris Eubank went on in the fashion that he did in his career. It makes you understand more why he was labelled as a guy that couldn't finish his dinner, or whatever you want to label him as. He never was the same fighter again after that fight, and then you have that incident in a short space of time. It makes you now realise that this is why he ended up the way he did. So we've covered the Nigel Benn fights. We've covered him going in the ring against some notable names from that particular era. Of course, Michael Watson being another one of them. And now we're at a point where we're moving into the latter stages of Chris's career as we move into part 3. Of course, we've got the fights with Steve Collins to cover. We've got the fights with Carl Thompson to cover, Joe Calzaghe, and the end of his career. And of course, some of the ventures that he's been involved with following his boxing career, and of course where he's at today. Really, really, really interesting character, still a prolific character, and still somebody that a lot of people revere to look up to. Now, I hope you've enjoyed the episode. I hope you've enjoyed listening to some elements of Chris's life and his boxing career. And if you have, please do let me know. You can let me know on Spotify by commenting on the episode on Spotify. If you're on Apple and you've been enjoying this episode and other episodes, leave a rating and leave a review. If you're on another podcasting app that has a review system, please make sure you do leave it. If you've listened to this via YouTube and you've not yet commented, please leave a comment. Thank you to those that commented on part 1 on YouTube. I appreciate YouTube as a video platform. I do like to put the audio on there because I know that some people do have the opportunity to listen to it via that platform as well. So thank you so much for those that have listened to the episode via YouTube as well. A big, big thanks goes to the patrons of the BTR Boxing Podcast Network. Thank you so much for supporting us, being so loyal. It's been so helpful to really get that little bit of additional financial income to support the podcast and to go out there and buy the literature that we need to continue to get great stories like this. There's various sources that get used for episodes. Books are a great place to start with. People ask me these questions all the time. Books are a really good place to start with. You've got books, you've got Associated Press articles, you've got tabloid newspaper articles in the historical archives. There's so many different places to actually go and get this information from and put these stories together. This is why I love doing what I do and why I love delivering it to you guys, and I appreciate the fact that you guys enjoy it too. So with that in mind, I'm going to bring an end to part 2. Thank you as always for listening to the show. We will be back very soon with the final part 3 of the Chris Eubank career profile on the BTR Boxing Podcast Network.